On the mornings when Seris Vale fought for other people's honor, she always woke before the bell towers did. Dawn in Lythre began softly, with light laid over the city like watered silk. The river running through its center caught the first pale gold, and the arched bridges rose out of the mist in quiet succession, each one traced with ward lanterns gone dim from the night. From the upper terrace outside her rooms, Seris could see tiled roofs, white stone halls, banners hanging limp in the still air, and beyond all of it the glimmering line of the eastern marshes where reeds gathered and bent in the unseen wind. She stood barefoot on the cold flagstones, a practice blade balanced across her palms, and breathed until the restlessness inside her settled into shape. 4 breaths to loosen the shoulders. 4 to steady the wrists. 4 to lower the pulse. By the time the city began to stir, she had already worked through the opening forms of the Vale sequence, cut through each turn and lunge of the river school, and repeated the final measure until every transition lay inside her muscles like scripture. When she stopped, no part of her trembled. Sweat dampened the nape of her neck beneath her dark braid, but her breathing remained even. That, more than any flourish, was what patrons paid for. Not simply that she won. Plenty of duelists won. Seris won without disorder. She turned at the sound of the inner door opening. Her landlord's daughter, a long-limbed girl of 12 named Pella, came padding out with a folded cloth over her arm and a look of solemn concentration she wore whenever she felt she was helping with important matters. "Your cuff wraps," Pella said. Seris accepted them. "You saved me 10 minutes. I counted them twice so they'd match. Then you saved me 20. Pella brightened. "Will you beat him quickly today?" Seris knotted the first wrap around her wrist. "No one worth fighting is beaten quickly." The girl considered that. "Will you beat him beautifully, then?" Seris allowed herself the smallest curve of a smile. "That is usually the intention." Pella drew closer, lowering her voice as if imparting a state secret. "Mama says de Micelle only hired you because Councillor Bren cannot hold a blade without looking like a frightened goose. Your mother should say less in doorways. She says it in kitchens. That is not better." Pella grinned, unrepentant, and retreated inside before her mother could be blamed for anything further. Seris finished binding her wrists and reached for the padded jacket hanging over the terrace rail. Today's duel was a contract bout in the Hall of Measures, not a grudge fight or a noble trial. No blood would be drawn if the judges could help it. 2 merchant houses disputed rights to a shipment route upriver, and because Lythre preferred ritual to feud, the matter had been given over to a ceremonial contest. De Micelle Fane had sponsored one side and hired Seris as champion. Councillor Bren, who had apparently lost either his nerve or his dignity, would watch from the patron's gallery and claim the victory if Seris earned it for him. It was clean work, as such things went. Clear rules. Honest pay. Few bruises if both sides behaved. Still, as she dressed, an old weariness moved through her like a shadow. There had been more of these bouts lately. More public ceremonies. More demands for spectacle. The city liked to say that Lythre's greatness rested on the refinement of its customs, that where other places settled disputes with ambush or war, Lythre resolved them beneath banners and music, with judges in silver collars and heralds speaking law before the first crossed blades. Seris believed in the principle of it. She always had. Yet lately the principle had become a performance for people who cared more for applause than resolution. She fastened the final clasp on her dark dueling coat and slid her formal blade into its lacquered sheath. The weapon was not ornate. Its guard was plain, its balance nearly severe. It suited her. She had never liked jewels hung on useful things. By the time she reached the street, the lower markets had begun to open. Bakers were lifting shutters, barge hands were hauling rope from damp decks, and the city's morning musicians, licensed players, mostly young, assigned to different squares by guild rotation, were warming bow and reed pipe in the cool air. Their half-formed scales drifted through the lanes like birds calling to each other through fog. Lythre was never silent. Even in mourning, it murmured. As Seris crossed Reedmaker Bridge, she passed 2 apprentices practicing footwork with willow rods under the eye of a grey-bearded instructor. Both boys straightened at the sight of her. One nearly dropped his rod into the river. "Hold your shoulders lower," she said without stopping. "If they rise, your center goes with them." The boy blushed crimson and obeyed at once. His companion stared after her as though a saint had just corrected his posture. Seris kept walking. Recognition followed her more now than it used to. Not celebrity exactly, Lythre adored novelty too much for that to last. But she had become something steadier than fashion. Reliable. Disgust. The name spoken when patrons wanted a victory that would not embarrass them. She had spent years making herself into that kind of certainty, years sanding away everything that might crack under pressure. The city rewarded such effort, though not always kindly. At the Hall of Measures, the square before the entrance was already crowded. Petitioners waited on the lower steps. Servants in house colors passed bundles of flowers and sealed documents between officials. Street vendors had gathered along the perimeter, selling sugared nuts, ribbons in faction colors, and small painted tokens carved like crossed blades. Above the main doors hung the white and blue banners of civic arbitration, fluttering in the soft wind. Seris went in by the duelist's passage, a narrower side entrance of polished stone and old ironwork. Within, the noise of the square softened into echoes. Servants moved briskly through corridors. Scribes carried ledger bundles to side chambers. Somewhere deeper in the hall, a quartet of guild musicians was rehearsing the ceremonial score for the morning's match. Violin first, then flute, then the low answering voice of a viola, the whole pattern neat and restrained. At the preparation rooms, she found Mela Quist already waiting. Her former master stood beside the long bench with his hands clasped behind him, his slate-colored coat buttoned to the throat. Age had drawn sharp lines around his mouth but not stooped his back. His gaze, when it fell on her, remained as unforgiving as it had been the first day he had corrected her grip with a switch to the knuckles. "You're early," he said. "You trained me. I also trained 3 men who still think punctuality means arriving before the second bell." Seris set her sheath on the bench. "Are you here as advisor or critic? With you, both are inevitable." That, from Mela, qualified as warmth. He circled her once, tugged a fold of her coat flatter at the shoulder, then nodded. "You've been tightening your recovery after the second turn. Half a breath. Useful if your opponent overcommits. He usually does." Mela's expression made it plain what he thought of usual assumptions. Drental isn't foolish. No. But he is proud. Yes. Proud men lunge to reclaim rhythm when they lose it. If he does, you'll see it in the left foot. Seris inclined her head. "I know." His gaze sharpened, but after a moment he said only, "Good." It would have been easier, perhaps, if Mela had ever spoken to her like a father. But he had not raised her, and sentiment was not his craft. What he had given her was sterner and perhaps more durable, attention. Precision. Standards that did not bend because she was tired, young, or alone. When her own father's debts had taken the family house and most of its contents, when everyone else had become interested in pity or advice, Mela had simply asked whether she meant to keep training. She had said yes. He had said, "Then stand correctly and do not waste my time." It had been the kindest thing anyone offered her that year. "Have you heard," he said, as if plucking the thought from a different room in his mind, "that the summer circuit may add a 6th public exhibition this month?" Seris looked up. 6. That's excessive. Apparently the council finds the crowds encouraging. The council doesn't have to hold the blade. The council rarely holds anything it cannot drop on someone else. That earned him the faintest smile. He glanced toward the corridor, lowering his voice. There's pressure from somewhere higher than the guilds. More ceremonies. Larger attendance. More ornate scoring. Musicians complain of exhaustion. So do judges. Then why approve it? Mela's mouth thinned. Because gold always sounds reasonable to the people who are already comfortable. Before Seris could answer, the door curtain rustled and Oren Thale swept in with a sheaf of tablets tucked under one arm. Lythre's heralds trained as carefully in posture as its duelists did, and Oren had the polished ease of a man who could announce a legal dispute, a wedding vow, or a burial rite with equal gravity. He wore deep blue trimmed in silver thread, his fair hair tied back neatly, and his pleasant expression already carried the faint strain of a schedule too full. "Master Quist. Lady Vale." He dipped a quick bow. "The judges are assembled." Dame Iselle has sent her compliments and asks only that no one falls dramatically enough to stain her mourning. Always a comfort, Seris said. Oren smiled, then shuffled his tablets. A minor adjustment to the formal sequence. There will be an additional witness invocation before the second pass. Mela frowned. Why? Order from Chancellor Ardin's office. Something about enhancing public clarity. Oren said it politely, which did not quite conceal his skepticism. The score has been amended accordingly. Again. Mela muttered. Seris held out a hand. Oren passed her the top tablet. The revised sequence was etched in narrow clerk's script, complete with notation for the musician's cue. She read it once, then again. The change was legal, but awkward. It shifted the tempo of the second exchange, lengthening the witness pause just enough to put more emphasis on the audience response. This is unnecessary, she said. Oren lowered his voice. Off the record, I agree. On the record, I am a graceful instrument of civic function and have no thoughts at all. An astonishing transformation. I practice at home. He tucked the remaining tablets under his arm. 5 minutes. When he was gone, Mela exhaled sharply through his nose. Ardin's people have no business meddling with match rhythm. Seris handed back the tablet. Then someone should tell them. Someone should. Whether anyone will is another question. A bell sounded through the hall, low and resonant. Seris drew on her gloves. The familiar stillness returned to her. Whatever irritation she felt at officials, amendments, or meddling music would remain outside the ring. Once the ceremony began, there was only movement, breath, angle, choice. Mela touched 2 fingers lightly to the back of her shoulder, his version of a blessing, and so rare that no one unacquainted with him would have noticed it as such. Win clean, he said. I always do. That is why I'm saying it again. The arena of the Hall of Measures was octagonal, its dueling floor set slightly below the tiered galleries so that spectators looked down as though into a crafted bowl of white stone and dark inlaid wood. Thin silver channels traced the floor's edges, old resonance lines polished by generations of use. Above, banners in civic blue hung between columns. Sunlight streamed from the high windows in angled shafts, broken by drifting incense from the ritual braziers. The chamber was nearly full. Merchants in layered silks leaned together in attentive knots. Junior magistrates sat with writing tablets ready. Noble patrons occupied the raised eastern gallery, where embroidered sleeves flashed when people gestured. Along the lower tiers clustered common citizens with enough coin or curiosity to attend public arbitration. Apprentices craned their necks. Vendors at the back whispered over wrapped sweets. The air carried anticipation, perfume, lamp oil, and the faint metallic whisper of tuned strings. When Seris stepped through the western arch onto the entry platform, a murmur ran through the room and then sharpened into applause. She inclined her head once, no more. Across from her, through the eastern arch, came Dren Tal, broad-shouldered and handsome in the smooth, open way some men used like a polished coin. He wore his house colors at the collar and saluted the crowd with a grin that invited them to admire his confidence. They liked him for it. Seris did not dislike him herself. Dren was vain, but not vicious. He fought well enough, especially when angry. Below the judge's bench, the musicians took their places, 2 bowed strings, flute, and hand drum. The witness scribe unrolled the ceremonial charter. Oren Thale stepped into the center in his herald's mantle and raised one hand for quiet. By charter of the hall and assent of the council, he began, voice carrying clear as a bell to the farthest seat. This formal bout is convened to settle the matter of upriver transit rights disputed between the houses of Selne and Corvée, with standing representation ceded to appointed champions under law and witnessed measure. The script flowed around Seris like water over stone. She had heard dozens of variations, some with more names, some with greater stakes, all following the same skeleton of language. Yet today, as the musicians threaded the opening measure beneath Oren's words, she felt a faint hitch in the floor's answering hum. Small. Brief. But wrong. Her attention did not shift visibly. She kept her posture composed, hands loose at her sides. Still, some alertness at the back of her mind turned toward the sensation. The resonance lines should have risen to meet the ceremony, steady and clean, like a choir joining a familiar refrain. Instead, there had been a slight drag, as though something beneath the surface had drawn the note downward. Oren concluded the invocation. The musicians changed key. The judges signaled. Seris and Dren descended onto the floor together. At first, there was only the old clarity. They saluted the bench, the patrons, and one another. The first pass began in measured tempo, blades meeting with the bright, distinct sound of disciplined steel. Dren came in aggressively, testing her centerline at once. Seris turned him aside, pivoted, and answered with a controlled diagonal cut he barely avoided. Their footwork traced the prescribed geometry across the inlaid wood. The musicians matched them beat for beat, drum pulse beneath bowed strings. Dren pressed hard. Pride, Mela had said, and there it was. He disliked losing rhythm. She disrupted it twice in the opening exchange and saw the answer immediately in his left foot, too eager, too forceful in recovery. She let him believe he had drawn her high, then slipped under his blade and touched the flat of her sword to his shoulder with perfect economy. A point to her. Applause rippled. They reset. The added witness invocation came before the second pass, exactly where the revised sequence had indicated. Oren spoke the amended lines. The audience responded on cue, a collective murmur of formal assent. The musicians held the note. Again, Seris felt it, that odd downward pull beneath the floor. Stronger this time. The hairs rose along her arms beneath her sleeves. Dren came at her as the second pass resumed, sharper now, stung by the first point against him. He was good enough that carelessness would have been punished, but Seris had built her livelihood on never confusing confidence with haste. She parried twice, stepped into his third line, and turned the momentum of his shoulder against him. He checked himself just in time to avoid losing balance entirely, but the strain showed. She heard the crowd react not merely to the near fall, but to the elegance of the correction. They liked grace almost as much as they liked danger. By the third pass, the chamber had settled into the kind of attention that gave public ritual its power. Hundreds of eyes following the same arc breath unconsciously timed to steal. Meaning gathered in the structure of the event. Seris could feel it now with unusual clarity, as though the whole room were one instrument tuned around the duel. And beneath that, still, the drag. When Dren overreached at last in his attempt to recover standing, she disarmed him with a crisp rotational bind that sent his blade skidding harmlessly across the floor. Gasps, then applause. He froze, chest heaving once, and looked at her with the blank fury of a man who knew he had just fulfilled someone else's expectation. Seris stepped back at once and lowered her sword in acknowledgement, allowing him dignity in defeat. The judges conferred for scarcely any time at all. By measure and witnessed form, Oren declared, the bout is awarded to Seris Vale, champion to the House of Seln. The chamber filled with sound. Dame Iselle, elegant in pale silver above the galleries, tapped gloved fingers together in approval. Councillor Bren looked relieved enough to weep. Dren retrieved his sword. For one uneasy instant, Seris thought pride might drive him into some stupid, unscripted gesture. Instead he bowed stiffly. Well done, he said, in the tone of a man who wished he had not been made to mean it. And to you, she replied. He left the floor to a respectful murmur from the audience. Seris turned for the formal acknowledgement to the bench, but as she did, something in the resonance lines flickered. Not visible to the crowd, perhaps. Not the sort of thing a non-sensitive observer would catch. Yet she felt it distinctly, a second pulse moving where the first should have faded, as if the released energy of the duel had not gone outward into the hall's warded channels, but downward into the foundations. Her composure did not break. She saluted, accepted the judgment, and withdrew beneath applause. Only once she passed beneath the western arch and the noise softened behind stone did she allow her brow to crease. Mela was waiting in the passage. You're frowning, he said. Should I fetch a physician? The city may fall. The floor carried oddly. His expression changed. How? Twice during the invocation. Once at the close. The resonance sank. Sank where? That's the question. He studied her face long enough to know she was not indulging fancy. Could the channels need retuning? They were retuned last month. So they said. Before either of them could continue, footsteps approached from the far corridor. A pair of junior attendants hurried by carrying garlands, followed by Lynette Raw with a stack of music folios pressed to her chest and ink on the side of her hand. Her dark curls were escaping their pins, and she looked like a woman currently offended by the existence of other people. Lynette, Seris said. The archivist stopped. If you ask whether the amended score was my idea, I'll commit a breach of decorum in 3 languages. So it wasn't. Chancellor's office. She shifted the folios higher. Again. We've had 3 revisions this week, all supposedly for civic clarity. If the council desires clarity, perhaps they could stop adding decorative nonsense where the old forms worked perfectly well. Did you feel the hall pull? Seris asked. Lynette blinked. Annoyance sharpened into alertness. You noticed it too? Mailer folded his arms. So it was not imagination. No. Lynette glanced down the corridor, then lowered her voice. The sustained note under the second witness phrase lost brightness as if something was drinking it. Mailer stared at her. That is a melodramatic way to describe theft. I am a musician. We are melodramatic by trade. Can you prove it? Not while carrying festival folios for people who think tempo markings are decorative suggestions. Seris exchanged a look with Mailer. Lynette saw it. Oh no, she said. That is the face of someone about to involve me in work. You noticed irregularity in the score, Seris said. I noticed it in the floor. If something is interfering with the hall's resonance, I want to know what. Lynette sighed the sigh of a woman who knew resistance was already pointless. Tonight. Guild Archive Annex. After sunset. If I'm dismissed from my post for colluding with duelists, I'll expect pastries. You prefer almond. I prefer not being ruined, but almond will do. She swept away before either of them could say more, called down the corridor by some exasperated stage steward demanding her attendance. Mailer watched her go, then turned back to Seris. You mean to pursue this? If the hall is compromised, yes. Quietly. Obviously. He made a dissatisfied sound, which in him usually meant agreement shadowed by worry. Do not let curiosity drag you into politics. In Lythre. Impossible. That was not a joke. Seris slid her blade back into its sheath. Neither was I. He muttered something that might have been a prayer or a complaint. The rest of the morning passed in the expected manner. Dame Iselle sent for Seris briefly to thank her for the clean victory and present the agreed fee in a velvet purse that weighed pleasantly in the hand. Councillor Bren praised her restraint at exhausting length. 2 lesser patrons made discreet inquiries about her availability for future matches. One overeager apprentice nearly collided with a pillar trying to bow in her direction. Through all of it, Seris remained civil, measured, and distant enough to preserve usefulness without inviting familiarity. By noon, she escaped into the open air. The square outside the Hall of Measures had grown busier, the sunlight warmer now against the pale stone. The city moved around her in layered currents, civic servants returning to offices, merchants arguing over ledgers, flower sellers raising fresh bundles to passers-by. Somewhere downriver a set of bells rang the middle hour. Seris paused on the top step and looked back once at the hall. It stood as it always had, graceful, orderly, crowned by old carvings of scales, reeds, and crossed blades. Nothing in its face suggested corruption. Nothing in its proportions betrayed misuse. That was the way of most dangerous things in Lythre. They arrived wearing ceremony. She started down the steps. Lady Vale. She turned to see Tavin Sorrel weaving through the crowd toward her, long-limbed and earnest, one side of his collar half-fastened as though he had dressed while running. He was one of Mailer's newest advanced students, talented enough to know it and young enough not yet to understand what talent did not protect. Master Sorrel, she said, because it pleased her occasionally to see him fluster when addressed too formally. It worked. I'm no master yet. Then stop bounding up public stairs like a hound and perhaps the city will assume dignity. He tried and failed not to grin. I saw the bout. So did half the city. Yes, but I saw the second turn. He mimed the disarming bind with reverent imprecision. How did you know he'd recover wide instead of straight? His pride arrived before his foot did. Tavin frowned in concentration. I don't understand. You will when you've watched men mistake emotion for strategy often enough. He absorbed that as if filing away a sacred text. Then, more shyly, would you ever consider opening a public class? Even once a month? No. The answer came so promptly that he laughed despite his disappointment. Why not? Because instruction is harder than performance, and I prefer not to fail at difficult things in front of groups. You don't fail. An impressive rumor. Keep it alive if you like me. He sobered. Lady Vale, is it true they're bringing in a masked duelist for the Moonfeast exhibition? The question caught her attention. Where did you hear that? Everyone's talking about it. They say he came from the Lake Principalities. Or from the Northern Courts. Or he's some disinherited lord hiding from creditors. Tavin leaned closer. One man in the lower yard swore he saw him practicing on the riverbank before dawn, and that his blade sang. Seris glanced at him. Blades do that when poorly tended. No, I mean, Tavin stopped, embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. He said the movement looked like music. There it was again. That strange convergence of sword and sound. A coincidence, likely. Lythre attracted traveling fighters whenever a rich festival season approached. Half of them carried invented legends the way actors wore masks. Still, something in the phrasing caught. Gossip improves with each retelling, she said. Yes, but are you going to fight him? If he exists and challenges properly. Tavin brightened at once. Then I hope he's excellent. That is a rude thing to say to me. It's the most respectful thing I can say to you, he replied, and because it was sincere, she let it stand. They parted at the lower square. Seris crossed into the market district, purchased a loaf, hard cheese, and a paper twist of preserved pears, then carried them back to her rooms through streets now heavy with afternoon warmth. Laundry lines stirred between upper windows. Barges moved slowly along the river. From one courtyard came the rhythmic stamping of dyers at work. From another, children practicing festival songs too loudly and half a note off. In her room, she set the purse from Dame Iselle on the table and ate standing at the window. Her rooms were plain, but they were hers. A narrow bed. A wardrobe. 2 chairs, one mended twice. A chest containing formal gear, training gloves, and the few personal belongings she had not sold during leaner years. On the wall beside the terrace door hung 3 practice blades and 1 framed certificate from the guild affirming her right to fight as an independent champion. The parchment was less beautiful than the money it represented, but more difficult to take away. She broke the bread, then paused. Below, in the lane, 2 musicians were passing, a violinist and a flutist, likely guild assigned to a wedding further upriver. They rehearsed as they walked, not the formal score from the hall, but a lilting dance air common to river feasts. The tune rose, dipped, turned on itself. Without warning, her mind returned to Linnet's description. As if something was drinking it. Seris set the bread down. The more she considered the morning's bout, the less she liked the shape of it. Public resonance was not a toy. The hall's channels had existed for generations to take the emotional and magical charge of a witnessed duel and disperse it safely into wardstones, bridge sigils, and the city's civic lattice. That was one reason ceremonial combat could remain ritual instead of riot. The energy created by concentrated attention and formal contest had somewhere lawful to go. If it was no longer going there. A knock sounded. Pella opened the door before Seris could answer and poked in her head. There's a message. From a man pretending not to be grand. The girl brought in a folded card on a tray far too large for it. So probably grand. Seris took the card and opened it. The hand was elegant, spare, unmistakably practiced. Lady Vale. Your presence is requested at moonrise 3 nights hence for the opening exhibition of the White Reed season. A visiting challenger of unusual distinction has petitioned for the honor of meeting Lythre's most exact champion before the assembled galleries. The city would be grateful for your participation. Oren Thale, by order of the festival office. Below, in a different hand, 4 words had been added. He insists upon you particularly. Seris looked up. Pella's eyes were bright with the effort not to look overeager. Is it dramatic? It may become inconvenient. That usually means yes. Seris folded the card shut. 3 nights hence. The opening exhibition of the White Reed season, the largest ceremonial sequence before midsummer, the one that pulled duelists, musicians, patrons, and opportunists from half the river states. Crowds would fill every tier. Wagers would spread through the markets like spilled dye. If the hall's resonance had been tampered with in an ordinary contract bout, a festival exhibition would magnify whatever was happening tenfold. And now some unnamed challenger had asked for her specifically. She turned the card over once in her hand. The surface was faintly scented with river reed and ash, an affectation she would have dismissed had the phrasing not snagged her attention. A visiting challenger of unusual distinction. She could practically hear Oren's dry voice behind the wording. A polite announcement wrapped around an eye roll. In the lane below, the musician's tune carried farther away, until only the final notes remained, thin as light on water. Seris set the card beside her uneaten bread and went to the wall where her formal blade hung. For a long moment she did not touch it. She only stood there, looking at the plain hilt, the disciplined lines, the familiar tool of every answer she knew how to give. Then she reached up and laid her hand around the grip. By moonrise 3 nights later, the city had remade itself in white banners. The White Reed season always altered Lythre, but this year the transformation seemed more thorough than ever. Streamers stretched between towers and bridges. Reed lanterns floated on the river in patient lines. Every market square carried musicians, flower sellers, fortune readers, spiced wine carts, and children darting under elbows with paper swans tied to strings. Crowds swelled well after dusk, their excitement rising with the music that threaded through the city in braided fragments, fiddle from one courtyard, drum from the next, voices turning festival refrains into something half sacred and half theatrical. Seris did not often dress for spectacle, but the exhibition required formal presentation. Her dueling coat tonight was midnight blue rather than black, the collar stitched in silver thread to meet festival standards. Her braid had been bound with a narrow pale ribbon by Pella, who claimed the city would riot if its champion looked insufficiently ceremonial. There are at least 3 apprentices already arguing over where you'll stand before the salute, Pella had informed her with authority. You must not disappoint them. I disappoint people daily. Not in the decorative way. Now, as Seris crossed the lantern-lit approach to the Hall of Measures, she ignored the glances that followed and kept her stride unhurried. The square was packed. Vendors shouted over one another. Noble carriages waited in orderly rows. Additional guard posts had been raised near the gates to manage the crowd, and the light from the braziers turned helmets and polished doorwork to gold. Inside, the atmosphere was more charged than it had been that morning, but no less disciplined. Festival attendants moved like clockwork. Musicians tuned inside alcoves. Heralds carried tablets and invitations from one station to another. Somewhere deeper in the complex, someone was laughing too loudly out of nerves. Oren intercepted her near the western passage. If you tell me this challenger is a prince in disguise, Seris said, I am leaving. His expression remained professionally bland. Only if you do so gracefully enough to satisfy the galleries. So he isn't. Not to my knowledge. Which, to be clear, has not been respected nearly enough this week. He handed her a narrow card bearing the evening's formal order. Her name was there, opposite a title rather than a man's proper identity. Exhibition champion of the Southern Gallery, Seris Vale. Festival challenger of the White Reed opening, the Swan Knight. She looked up. The Swan Knight. Oren sighed faintly. Yes. I regret to inform you that the city has met a mask and become poetic. Who named him? The lower market, I believe. Or the West Quay. These things spread. Someone saw feathers embroidered on his cloak. Someone else saw him step from a river boat at dawn and decided mystery was required. Do you know his real name? If I do, it has not been entrusted to me in any useful manner. Oren's mouth twitched. He fights under guest petition, fully sealed. All lawful. Convenient. It is festival season. Convenience has been outlawed. She glanced past him toward the arena doors. And what do you think? Personally, he said quietly, I think every adjustment to these ceremonies lately has made the room feel more crowded even before the audience arrives. Professionally, I think your challenger has increased ticket sales by a vulgar margin. That almost made her smile. Oren straightened as an attendant passed. He's already in preparation. You'll have the floor first. Chancellor Arden and half the council are present. Then I'll endeavor not to trip in front of governance. Please don't. I have a schedule to maintain. He was swept away before she could say more. Mailer waited in the preparation room, though this time his severity looked sharpened by concern. Have you heard anything useful? Seris asked. Only that your masked swan has beaten 2 visiting champions in private verification bouts without leaving either humiliated. That sounds almost charitable. That is what troubles me. Seris took off her outer gloves and began fastening the fitted pair beneath. A duelist who shows restraint. A duelist who wins while appearing not to want to. That struck closer than she liked. You've seen him. A glimpse. Not enough. Mailer's gaze dropped to the card in her hand. The city has fallen in love with his mystery already. That makes people foolish. People were foolish before mystery. Yes, but now they are romantic about it. She set the card down. Lynette. In the gallery annex with her ink and her indignation. She found irregular notations in the revised festival scores, but nothing she can yet prove to be criminal. Only unnecessary. Complicated. Hungry, in her words. Hungry again. Seris flexed her fingers once inside the gloves. If the hall pulls strangely tonight, we will know it is not accident. Mailer gave a curt nod. Then keep your senses open. And do not let the crowd provoke you into ornament. Have I ever fought for ornament? No. But there is always a first moral failing. Before she could answer, the bell for first assembly rang through the chamber, fuller and brighter than the morning tone. Seris drew one slow breath. Her body knew this threshold. The moment before public entry. The narrowing of the world into sequence and nerve. Yet beneath that familiar readiness lived something less familiar tonight, anticipation sharpened by curiosity. The Swan Knight. She disliked the title already. It sounded like something composed by people who had never held a sword and believed longing improved any noun it touched. Still, when the arena call came and she stepped into the western light, she felt the whole hall gather around the event with an almost physical force. The galleries were overflowing. White banners hung in layered folds from every pillar, and fresh reed garlands had been wound along the railings until the chamber looked less like a civic hall than a ritual grove made of stone. Musicians lined the lower wall in greater number than usual for a mere exhibition, strings, flute, hand drum, even a small harp worked into the ensemble for festival richness. The audience shimmered with expectation. Nobles leaned forward. Apprentices looked ready to stop breathing entirely. Seris descended to the platform as applause greeted her, warm and assured. She saluted once and took her place. Oren's voice rang clear through the chamber, invoking festival law, guest right, and ceremonial witness. The music beneath his words was stranger tonight, lighter on the surface and yet carrying a deep undernote that unsettled her more than she wanted to show. The hall answered the ritual. She felt the resonance gather. And then the eastern doors opened. For one suspended instant, the audience seemed to forget itself. He entered in white and ash grey, not gaudy but unmistakable. His dueling coat was cut close for movement, its lines elegant and severe, with the faint sheen of feather pattern embroidery at the cuffs where the light caught. A narrow half-mask of pale lacquer concealed the upper part of his face, leaving his mouth and jaw visible. Dark hair, almost black in the torchlight, had been tied back simply at the nape. He was neither broad nor imposing in the blunt way some fighters tried to be. Instead, he carried himself with a contained grace that altered the space around him, as though every step belonged to a silent measure only he could hear. But it was the stillness in him that held her. Not arrogance. Not theatrical mystery. Restraint. He came down to the floor with his head slightly inclined, as though apologizing inwardly for all the eyes upon him. The hall had already named him beautiful, Seris thought. The city would not be wrong. Yet beauty alone did not explain the hush that had fallen. It was something else, the sense of a man standing inside tension so carefully mastered that the effort of it turned luminous. Oren named him by title only. The Swan Knight bowed first to the judges, then to the galleries, then turned to Seris. Up close, the details sharpened. He was younger than rumor would have made him and older than an untested prodigy. His mouth was calm, but not indifferent. There was sorrow in it, faint and astonishing. And when he raised his blade in salute, he did so with such exact courtesy that Seris felt, absurdly, as though he had offered trust before they had even crossed steel. She returned the salute. The musicians began. From the first exchange, she knew every rumor had failed. He moved unlike any duelist she had fought before. Not because he was wild, he was not. Not because he lacked schooling, he clearly had plenty. But his style did not divide precision from fluidity. It joined them. His blade seemed to answer the music rather than merely keeping time with it, and his footwork flowed through transitions so seamless that for a heartbeat she understood why some witless observer had claimed his sword sang. The impression was not entirely foolish. Seris met him with her own discipline, matching structure to grace, line to curve. Steel rang between them. The crowd reacted instantly, a collective intake, then the rise of delight. He was fast. More troubling, he adapted. On the second pass she shifted tempo to test his recovery. He answered not with force but with intelligent yielding, giving ground just enough to turn her advantage into a neutral line. On the third, he drew her into a pattern that felt almost conversational, as if each exchange were not only combat but inquiry. What do you favor? Where do you hold? What do you hide? She disliked how quickly she became aware of him as a mind. The music swelled under them. The hall's resonance rose. And underneath it, there it was again, that subtle, wrong pull beneath the floor, stronger now than in the morning. Her attention fractured for less than a breath. He saw it. Noticed, adjusted, and instead of pressing mercilessly into the opening as many duelists would have done, he checked his strike just enough to avoid turning advantage into injury. The touch still landed, clean, unmistakable, a point against her, but the restraint of it startled her more than the loss. They reset. Across the space between them, his gaze met hers through the pale mask. The audience was applauding too loudly to hear anything softer than music, yet she could have sworn apology flickered there. Then the next pass began. This time Seris drove harder, irritated less by the point than by the fact that he had shown mercy with such skill she could not resent it openly. He turned one strike, then another, their blades crossing so close she heard his breath. He smelled faintly of cold water and something like ash wood. His movements remained beautiful, infuriatingly so, but no longer distant. There was strain in them now, hidden under the elegance. Effort. Control under pressure. He did not want to hurt her. The knowledge unsettled her almost as much as the attention that followed it. No, not attention, she corrected inwardly, too sharply. Focus. The exhibition lengthened beyond ordinary measure because the crowd would not have forgiven brevity. Oren gave the witness phrases. The musicians turned through the score's rising sequence. The audience became a living wall of focus around them, every eye fixed on the interplay of discipline and music, dark and white, certainty and enigma. Beneath it all the hall kept pulling, gathering, drinking. Seris felt it strongest during a held bind near the close. Their blades locked. Their faces were close enough that she could see the tension in the muscles at the side of his mouth. For an instant the performance of rivalry fell away. His voice came low, barely a thread beneath the music. Did you feel that? She should not have answered. Yes. A flicker crossed his expression, not triumph, but recognition. Then they broke apart before anyone could suspect speech had passed between them. The final exchange came swiftly after. She pressed, determined now to force either truth or error from him. He yielded 2 steps, turned on the third, and with a motion so swift it seemed almost inevitable, he redirected her blade wide and placed his own at the edge of her guard in a flawless finishing line. The touch was light. The victory, undeniable. For half a breath, silence held. Then the hall erupted. The sound rolled upward, applause and astonishment braided together. The city loved novelty, the city loved mastery, most of all, The city loved seeing one certainty unsettled by another. Seris stood still in the center of it, pulse steady despite the heat in her face. He stepped back at once and lowered his sword. Again there was that grief in his eyes. Not pride. Not exultation. Grief. Oren declared the result. The Swan Knight had won the exhibition. White reed petals rained from the upper gallery as festival attendants, too well drilled to waste spectacle, cast them on cue from silver baskets. The musicians struck the closing phrase. The judges rose. The audience leaned toward the mystery they had been given and loved him for it before he had even left the floor. Seris bowed because the form required it. He returned the bow as if it mattered desperately. Then he turned away. She watched him mount the eastern steps beneath thunderous applause, white petals catching in the dark fall of his hair and across the shoulders of his coat. He did not bask in the crowd's adoration. He moved through it like a man crossing rain. And under the soaring close of the music, Seris felt the resonance plunge hard beneath the hall. This time there was no mistaking it. Something below the floor took hold of the magic released by the match and dragged it downward so sharply that dizziness flashed at the edges of her vision. She stopped it from reaching her face by force of habit alone. When she reached the western passage, Mela caught her arm once, not gently. You felt it. Yes. How bad? Worse. Before he could ask more, voices rose down the adjoining corridor, festival attendants shouting, someone running, a case of instruments dropped hard enough to crack wood. Lythre appeared around the bend with her skirts gathered in one hand and 3 loose sheets of notation in the other. The lower strings went flat mid-score, she said without preamble. Not from tuning. From drain. And the witness chimes in the south alcove have gone dead. Mela stared at her. Dead. As in silent. As in charmed bronze that has rung for 40 years and now behaves like kitchen metal. Seris looked back toward the arena wall, as though stone might become transparent if she willed it hard enough. Applause still thundered on the far side, though beginning to soften as the event moved into its closing rites. That was not incidental, she said. No, Lythre replied. And unless festival spirits have developed an interest in sabotage, someone is feeding on the ceremonies. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. Seris turned instinctively. For a moment, between one pillar and the next, she saw him, the Swan Knight, no longer framed by public light but by the dimmer lamps of the service passage. Unattended. Motionless. The mask still hid his eyes, yet she knew he was looking at her. Not challenging. Not gloating. Waiting. Then an official called for him from the adjoining hall, and he was gone. Seris stood very still, the echo of the duel still alive in her blood and the wrongness beneath the floor settling into certainty. The city was cheering a mystery in white feathers. But the man behind the mask had felt the pull too. And whether that made him an ally, a threat, or something far more dangerous, she knew one thing with perfect clarity. This was no longer only an exhibition. The city would not stop talking about him. By the morning after the White Reed opening, sketches of the Swan Knight had already appeared in the lower market, each one worse than the last. In one, he looked like a saint with a sword. In another, an avenging ghost with feathers for hair. A pastry seller near Reedmaker Bridge had produced a sugared bun shaped vaguely like a swan and named it after him before midday, to the visible disgust of his wife, who thought the whole enterprise vulgar. Seris walked past all of it with the steady expression she reserved for things that were both absurd and inconvenient. Inside, however, she was unsettled in ways she did not enjoy examining. She had been beaten cleanly, which was unpleasant but not intolerable. Worse things had happened to her than public defeat. A blade could slip, a better duelist could appear, a rhythm could turn. None of that was the true disturbance. What lingered was the memory of the man beneath the mask, the impossible grace of his movement, the sorrow in his eyes when the crowd applauded, the low murmur between locked blades. Did you feel that? Yes. That exchange had been real. So had the sharp plunge of magic beneath the floor at the end of the match. Lythre's dead chimes confirmed it, and yet the city spoke only of spectacle, beauty, mystery, and whether the Swan Knight might unseat the reigning exhibition champions one by one before midsummer. No one in the square outside the Hall of Measures argued about siphoned civic resonance. They argued about whether his shoulders had seemed too narrow for a northern fighter and whether Seris had looked angry enough to demand a rematch. That last rumor, at least, was useful. Useful things were easier to carry than feelings. At noon she went to the Guild Archive Annex, a long river-facing building behind the musicians' court, where the shutters were usually half closed to preserve the old parchment from direct sun. The annex smelled of dust, wax, and old wood polish, with a faint permanent undercurrent of ink. Lythre had sent word that she had something to show. Seris found her hunched over a table beneath a forest of stacked folios, spectacles sliding down her nose, 2 ribbons clenched between her teeth while she turned pages with ink-stained fingers. 3 slate tablets lay arranged in order beside her, each marked with notations so dense they looked like a storm of black hooks and lines. "You resemble a siege," Seris said. Lythre spat the ribbons into her hand. "And you resemble a woman who has come to stand there while I rescue her city from the consequences of decorative officials. What have you found? Enough to make me feel clever and not enough to make me feel safe." She beckoned Seris closer. "Look here." Seris stepped beside the table. Lythre laid one palm flat on a score labeled for the White Reed opening exhibition. "These added measures from the last 3 weeks aren't random embellishments. They all do the same thing." Slightly lengthened witness pauses. Repeated harmonic echoes where older forms resolved cleanly. Chime reinforcement in the lower register instead of the upper. "That sounds like music," Seris said. "It is music. More importantly, it is architecture." Lythre tapped the ink with one short nail. Ceremonial scores help guide the resonance produced by the duel. The old compositions lift and disperse. These revisions gather and hold before releasing. Not enough for most people to notice in one bout. But if someone wanted to redirect accumulated charge, they would need the pattern to linger. "Yes." Lythre reached for another tablet. "Now add this. The hall's maintenance records were altered 2 months ago. South channel recalibration delayed. Witness chime replacements ordered, then quietly substituted with cheaper bronze that carries resonance poorly. Someone has been making the hall more absorbent and less stable." Seris crossed her arms. "Can you prove who approved it?" "Not yet. The signatures route through festival clerks and civic assistants like a nest of snakes." Lythre leaned back with a sigh. "But the amendments all trace upward to Chancellor Arden's administrative office." Seris had expected as much and still disliked hearing it aloud. Arden smiled too easily and spoke too smoothly. He had the polished self-possession of a man who considered every room an audience and every tradition a thing to be arranged for effect. Publicly, he championed civic renewal, cultural refinement, and broader participation in ceremonial life. In practice, he seemed to believe every old form needed his hand upon it. "He was in the gallery last night," Seris said. "He is always in the gallery when there are important people to be seen beside." Lythre squinted up at her. "I've also learned something less pleasant." "That narrows nothing." The Swan Knight's petition was expedited. Seris went still. "By whom?" "Festival Office Relay, Special Seal Authorization." Again, Arden's channels. Lythre read her expression at once. "I am not saying your mysterious rival is part of it. But you are saying he arrived conveniently. I'm saying someone wanted him in that hall before the whole city." That thought had already occurred to Seris in the dark hours before dawn and had done nothing to improve her temper. She remembered the way he had checked his strike when she faltered, the unmistakable recognition in his voice, the almost pained courtesy of his bow. Those things argued against willing complicity. Yet good manners were not proof of innocence. "What now?" she asked. Lythre rubbed the bridge of her nose, leaving a faint ink streak there. "Now we need a look beneath the hall. That will be difficult. Everything useful is difficult. Otherwise counselors would do it." Seris almost smiled. A knock sounded at the annex door. Both women looked up. An apprentice from the music court poked his head in, breathless. "Mistress Raw? They need you in the West practice chamber. The festival quartet says their tuning forks are behaving strangely." Lythre shut her eyes. "Of course they are. Why should metal not begin to despair when institutions do?" She shoved away from the table, gathered 2 folios and 1 tablet, then pointed the spare ribbon at Seris. Do not disappear. Come back at sunset. I'll see whether I can pry loose the older Undercroft maps. When Seris stepped back into the lane, the sun had shifted westward and the city's white festival banners shone almost painfully bright. She turned toward the training courts near the South Terraces, intending to work until thought became simpler. It almost succeeded. The court was half occupied by lesser competitors preparing for later white reed matches. Practice blades flashed under the awning shade. Boots scuffed chalk lines. Somewhere nearby, a fencing master shouted at 2 boys for confusing aggression with skill. Seris claimed an empty corner strip, removed her outer coat, and began with the opening veil sequence to steady herself. 1 cut. Turn. Recover. Draw the line. Breathe. By the 4th repetition, the restlessness in her body had narrowed into discipline. By the 8th, she sensed someone watching. She did not stop. She completed the phrase, reset her feet, and only then turned. He stood just beyond the awning post at the edge of the court, dressed plainly enough that a less attentive eye might have missed him. No exhibition whites now. No public featherwork. Just a dark coat, gloves, boots still carrying the faint dust of the street. The mask was gone. So was the last comfortable distance between rumor and man. His face was not less striking without concealment. It was more human, which made it more dangerous. Dark hair, slightly loosened at the temples as though he had run a hand through it too often. A mouth too inclined toward restraint to ever be careless. And eyes grey, though not cold, shadowed by the same sorrow she had glimpsed through lacquer. Around the court, 2 apprentices had already noticed him and were whispering fiercely. Seris held his gaze. You have created a nuisance. He glanced, almost apologetically, toward the whispering boys. I did not intend to. That is not the part one meant. A pause. Then, very slightly, one corner of his mouth shifted. No. I thought not. He did not step nearer until she nodded once. Even then he moved with that same contained grace, as if careful not to crowd the air between them. I hoped to speak with you privately, he said. And chose a public court. I tried your rooms first. Your landlord's daughter informed me that if my intentions were dishonorable, she would hit me with a flower pot. Seris stared at him. I believed her, he added. That was wise. A flicker of warmth passed through his expression and vanished almost at once. May we walk? Seris weighed the request for a breath. Whatever else he was, he had felt the siphon in the hall. If he meant harm, she would rather meet it with open eyes. If he meant truth, they had wasted enough time already. She sheathed her practice blade, gathered her coat, and nodded toward the quieter lane behind the court. They crossed into a narrow path shaded by cypress and old river stone, where the festival noise faded to a far-off murmur. For a few moments neither spoke. Seris was uncomfortably aware of his nearness, of the fact that in ordinary daylight he seemed less like a legend and more like a man who had gone too long without rest. At last he said, My name is Ivan Marceau. It was not a name she had heard in the city yet. Not one of Lythre's clipped merchant names or riverhouse titles. Softer, older around the edges. Seris Vale, she replied. He looked at her then with a kind of grave amusement. I was aware. Good. We can avoid the formalities. Another pause. She let him have it. A man who approached a duelist in secret after publicly defeating her deserved at least enough silence to see whether he wasted it. I owe you honesty, he said at last, or as much of it as I can risk. I am not in Lythre by accident. I came because the white reed season gathers strong ceremonial fields, old music, and public witness. I suspected something here was being altered. You suspected before you arrived? Yes. Why? His jaw tightened slightly. Because I have seen the beginning of it elsewhere. That sharpened her attention. Elsewhere where? The Lake Principalities. Smaller rites. Marriage vows that left the pair ill for days. River boundary ceremonies that weakened the local warding instead of renewing it. A duel court in Cesar where 3 fighters collapsed after a festival week and no one could explain why. He looked ahead as he spoke rather than at her, as though the memory itself required distance. The pattern was faint, but familiar. Gathered resonance disappearing into the foundations of public rites. Someone is learning how to feed on ceremony. Seris folded her coat over one arm. And you followed it to Lythre? Yes. Conveniently under special petition. A thread of understanding crossed his face. You know about that. I know enough to dislike it. So do I. He exhaled once, quiet and tired. My petition was encouraged by a man in Arden's outer office who claimed the exhibition would give me access I could not otherwise gain. I should have asked why the help was offered so easily. Why didn't you? This time the answer took longer. Because I needed sanctioned duels. There it was. The unfinished truth he had carried in the ring. Seris stopped walking. He stopped too. For what? She asked. His expression altered in a way she could not at first name, something like shame, but gentler, deeper. If I tell you, you may decide I am either mad or dangerous. I have met both. Continue. He looked at her a long moment, perhaps measuring whether she would laugh, recoil, or do something worse, pity him. Apparently he found none of those in her face, because when he spoke, his voice dropped almost to a confession. I am under a binding curse. I was not born fully human, though I have spent most of my life in that shape. My mother's line carries swan blood. Transformation was once natural to us, seasonal and voluntary. Mine is no longer voluntary. He swallowed once. Years ago a rite was turned against me. Since then, my human form holds only if I continue to win consecrated bouts. Sanctioned ones. Witnessed ones. Public enough to feed the binding. Even had she not trained herself to keep still, the seriousness in his voice would have prevented any careless reaction. Seris only looked at him. You are a swan shifter, she said. Yes. And if you stop winning, the curse takes more of me each time. His hand flexed once at his side. Voice first. Then memory. Then whatever part remains able to choose. I lose days when the binding weakens. Longer, recently. The lane seemed suddenly quieter. Even the festival sounds beyond the cypress walls felt farther away. Seris knew enough of transformation magic to understand the cruelty of such a thing. A shifter's form was not costume. It was identity, blood, resonance, selfhood. To force that relationship into a contest of public conquest was monstrous in its precision. And yet, she said carefully, you investigate siphoned duels while depending on the same system to survive. A painful half-smile touched his mouth. Yes. It is not a noble arrangement. No, she said. It is a cruel one. Something in him shifted at that. Not relief exactly. More like surprise that she had named the wound correctly. I do not enjoy fighting, he said. I noticed. I have hurt people before I learned full control. His gaze dropped briefly to his gloved hands. Not gravely. Never by choice. But enough. Enough to know I despise winning when it is bought that way. And yet you beat me. I know. The words held no triumph at all. Only regret so plain she could not misread it. Seris ought to have remained guarded. Instead, against her better instincts, her curiosity deepened into something more dangerous, sympathy. She turned and resumed walking. After a beat, he fell into step beside her. If what you say is true, she said, then someone using ceremonial duels to siphon magic may also understand curse binding. I believe so. Do you know who cursed you? His answer came flat. Not with certainty. Only that the rite was brokered through people who sold access to altered ceremonial law. That was enough to darken her thoughts considerably. They reached the end of the cypress path, where the lane opened toward a small overlook above the river. Water flashed between rooftops. White lanterns drifted beneath the nearest bridge, bright even in daylight. Neither moved immediately back toward the crowded street. Seris leaned one shoulder against the stone rail. Lythre Raw has proof the festival scores were altered to gather and hold resonance. Maintenance records at the hall were also quietly changed. I do not know Lythre Raw. She is an archivist with a talent for fury. That sounds useful. It is. Seris studied him openly now. If you are lying to me, you have chosen a laborious method. He gave a quiet, almost startled laugh. It transformed his face for an instant, softening it so completely that she understood at once why the city had become foolish. I am not lying, he said. You may still be mistaken. That is possible. I would prefer not to be. She considered. Then, if we are both hunting the same truth, we may as well stop circling one another like offended cats. His brows lifted slightly. I did not know you thought of yourself as a cat. I do not. You, however, have the air of a marsh bird pretending at manners. That laugh again, softer this time. I suppose I deserve that. The sound unsettled her more than his elegance had. It was too easy to imagine wanting to hear it again. She pushed off the rail. Come to the archive annex at sunset. Lynette has undercroft maps if the gods are merciful. If she decides you are ornamental, you will have to survive her opinions. I have survived worse. Perhaps. I have not seen her in a full temper. When they reached the busier lane, Seris noticed at once the way eyes shifted toward them. A vendor straightened. Two apprentices pretended with insulting transparency not to stare. A pair of society women near the ribbon stall exchanged expressions of such delighted interest that Seris immediately regretted the last 2 minutes of her life. Ivan noticed too. This may become difficult. It already has. He hesitated. Lady Vale, Seris. She turned. If the city sees us speaking, let them believe what they like. A rivalry is better cover than trust. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Good. I would hate for them to mistake us for friends. No, he said, and the faint warmth at the edge of his mouth made the word far too intimate for what it meant. Of course. He inclined his head and went the opposite direction, vanishing into festival brightness with a swiftness that suggested he had spent a long time learning how not to be followed. Seris stood very still. Then one of the ribbon stall women sighed audibly behind her and said to her companion, "Oh, now there is definitely a story there." Seris walked away before she could be arrested for discourtesy. At sunset, the archive annex gained one more problem. Lynette looked up from a spread of brittle maps just in time to see Ivan step in behind Seris. Her eyes moved from his face to Seris's expression and back again. Then she removed her spectacles with great care and set them on the table. I had expected a conspiracy, she said. I had not expected cheekbones. Seris shut the door behind them. Behave. I am behaving. Privately, and with scholarly precision. Lynette pointed at Ivan. If you are here to be ornamental, leave. If you are here to be useful, sit. Ivan, to his credit, only inclined his head and obeyed. Within minutes the maps had displaced awkwardness. Lynette spread 3 undercroft diagrams across the table, one current, one older, and one so faded it had to be weighted at the corners with inkstones to keep from curling closed. Together they compared hall foundations, ward channel routes, and old civic reservoirs meant to collect overflow resonance for maintenance rights. There, Ivan said at last, touching a narrow inked corridor beneath the dueling floor. That channel should empty into the East River cistern. It did 20 years ago, Lynette said. This revision wall was added later when the hall annex was expanded. Then why does the current map show a sealed diversion to the Hall of Measures undervault? Seris asked. Lynette looked at the overlay again, then swore softly. Because someone relabeled it as drainage. It is not drainage, Ivan said. It is a catch line. The 3 of them went still around the table. A catch line. A path designed not to disperse ritual force, but to gather and hold it. Lynette leaned back slowly. If that undervault has been converted into a reservoir, every major match this season could be filling it. How much would that matter? Seris asked. Lynette gave her a bleak look. Enough to weaken bridge wards, dim harbor protections, interfere with oath sigils, and leave every civic right for the last decade looking trustworthy by comparison. Enough, Ivan said quietly, to power something else entirely. They all knew the weight of that. Seris straightened. Then we need eyes on the undervault. Lynette stared. Do you? Yes. Tonight? Yes. Lynette pressed thumb and forefinger to her brow. Wonderful. At last my work becomes criminal in a way the archives never prepared me for. Ivan glanced toward the window, where the last red gold of evening had faded from the river-facing glass. Festival musicians begin the lantern procession in less than 1 hour. The hall will be crowded above and chaotic around the serviceways. That may be our best chance. Lynette looked between them. You have done this before. No, Seris said. Yes, Ivan said at the same time. Seris turned to him. His expression became sheepish in a way that would have been amusing if the circumstances were not increasingly dire. I have had to enter places uninvited. Because you are cursed? Because I prefer not to die. Lynette pointed at him. I like him less than I expected, which is probably a good sign. They left the annex separately to avoid notice, regrouping after dusk behind the old west colonnade near the Hall of Measures. The city above them pulsed with festival life. Reed lanterns floated down the river. Music from the procession carried through the streets in shimmering strands of flute and hand drum. The hall itself blazed with light, busy with evening ceremonies and administrative receptions. Seris wore a dark plain coat over her training clothes and had bound her braid close against her neck. Lynette, who had insisted she was not physically suited to skulking, had nevertheless brought a ring of copied keys and 3 folded permission slips of questionable usefulness. Ivan moved as he always seemed to move, quietly enough to make the dimness around him seem cooperative. The West Service entry was guarded, but not carefully. Festival strain made institutions sloppy. While 2 attendants argued over lantern inventory, Lynette slipped a copied key into the side gate lock. It resisted once, twice, and then yielded with a click so small Seris barely heard it. They went in single file. The underpassages smelled of old stone, lamp smoke, and river damp. Their footfalls echoed softly. Above and beyond the walls, muted through layers of masonry, came the distant pulse of music and crowd noise. Lynette led them through a records hall, down a narrow stair, and along a maintenance corridor lined with old resonance chimes boxed for repair. At the second landing, the air changed. Seris felt it before she could explain it, a heaviness, not physical exactly, but magical, as though the space below had become saturated with held intention. Ivan felt it too. She saw the line of his shoulders tighten. That way, he whispered. At the corridor's end stood an iron-banded door not marked on the public maps. New lock. Civic seal. No windows. Lynette's mouth flattened. That is not drainage. No, Seris said. Ivan set one hand lightly to the wood and closed his eyes. The moment he did, a faint shiver ran through him, as if the surface itself were vibrating under his palm. There is stored resonance behind this, he said. A great deal of it. Can you open it? Seris asked. Not without a louder approach than I'd prefer. Lynette knelt at the lock. Stand aside. If I ruin my hands for this, I expect to be remembered as a martyr of useful paperwork. She worked quickly, muttering to herself, testing one key, then another, then sliding a narrow strip of tension metal between bolt and plate. Seris listened to the corridor. Above, faintly, the lantern procession swelled. Voices rose in ritual refrain. The timing made her skin crawl. Public witness above. Gathered force below. The lock gave. Lynette looked up triumphantly. I hate that I'm good at this. Ivan opened the door. Beyond lay a circular chamber sunk beneath the hall like the inside of a buried bell. Old civic stone had been overlaid with newer metal channels, all of them converging inward toward a central basin of pale crystal and silverwork. It was half full of light. Not ordinary light. Resonant light, soft, shifting, threaded with color like music made visible. It pulsed in time with the distant sounds above, growing brighter each time the lantern procession chorus reached its refrain. The whole chamber hummed with stolen ceremony. For a breath, none of them spoke. Then Lynette whispered, Saints preserve us. Seris stepped forward slowly. The basin's surface trembled like water, though nothing touched it. Around the rim had been etched a lattice of formal marks, dual notation, witness sigils, oath-binding fragments, and something else woven through them, curse geometry. Ivan had gone utterly still beside her. She looked at him. He was pale. You know that pattern, she said. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. Part of it. She followed his gaze to a repeating hooked sigil worked into the silver channels. "The curse that binds your form," she said. "Yes." Cold moved through her chest, clean and hard. Whatever this was, it was larger than a corrupt official skimming excess magic from civic rights. Someone had built a reservoir beneath the heart of Lythre using the same altered ceremonial language that chained Ivan to sanctioned victory. The duels were not merely being exploited. They were being studied, reproduced, weaponized. A sound broke from the corridor behind them. Footsteps. Not one set. Several. Lythre swore under her breath. Seris turned at once, hand going to the hilt at her side. Ivan stepped subtly between her and the chamber center, his expression gone from weary gentleness to a cold readiness that transformed him more completely than the mask ever had. Voices approached. Saw the west seal disturbed. Check the lower vault. Torchlight flickered along the stair bend. Seris drew her blade halfway, then stopped. If guards found them armed over an illegal reservoir, explanations would be difficult and brief. If they retreated too slowly, they would be trapped below. Ivan's gaze met hers. In that heartbeat of shared decision, something passed between them more certain than either wanted to name. Trust, sudden and absolute. He leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "Let them think we are here for each other." Her brows knit. "What?" "The rivalry." His eyes were intent, urgent. "Use it." The footsteps were almost upon them. Seris understood all at once. Scandal was often easier for institutions to tolerate than conspiracy. If discovered, a private clandestine meeting between festival rivals in a restricted hall could be dismissed, gossiped over, buried. Evidence of siphoned civic magic could not. She sheathed her blade in one smooth motion. Then, before propriety could interfere, she caught the front of his coat, pulled him against the shadowed wall beside the open door, and said in a voice sharp enough to carry, "You are either the most reckless man in Lythre or the dullest." The guards rounded the corner with torches raised. For one impossible instant, Seris became acutely aware that Ivan was very close. One hand had come reflexively to her waist to steady the sudden movement. His breath caught. The corridor narrowed to warmth, shadow, and the stunned nearness of him. Then the lead guard stopped short. The man blinked. Looked from Seris to Ivan, to the half-open vault, back to Seris. "My lady," he said, with the helpless tone of someone who had not prepared for this category of problem. "This section is restricted." Seris let cold fury enter her expression as though she had been interrupted in some deeply personal dispute. Clearly. The guard, poor soul, looked as though he would have preferred armed smugglers. Ivan lowered his gaze just enough to appear chastened without seeming weak. It was alarmingly convincing. "We lost our way," he said. Lythre, still half crouched by the lock with one stolen key in hand, rose with astonishing composure. "And I, of course, was attempting to correct it." The second guard peered past them toward the chamber. The vault seal was opened. Seris turned on him with such perfect offended hauteur that even Lythre later admitted admiration. "Then perhaps your seals are less secure than the council imagines. Must I report that personally, or will one of you discover competence before I leave?" The first guard colored at once. The second looked uncertain. Neither seemed eager to accuse the city's reigning duelist and its newest festival darling of anything more specific than impropriety. And because Lythre loved scandal nearly as much as spectacle, both men's imaginations had plainly already done the rest. "We will escort you out," the first guard said stiffly. "How generous," Seris replied. They were led back through the underpassages under awkward, increasingly rigid silence. Lythre kept her face arranged into archivist disapproval. Ivan said nothing. At the outer gate, the guards released them with repeated reminders that lower service corridors were not for festival wandering. Once safely beyond the colonnade and out into the cooler river dark, Lythre folded over laughing soundlessly, one hand braced on the wall. Seris stared at her. "Compose yourself." "I am trying," Lythre managed. "I am simply failing from excellence." Even Ivan, who had looked tense and pale beneath the vault, gave in to one breath of startled laughter. That sound did far more damage to Seris's composure than the guards had. Lynette straightened at last and wiped at her eyes. Well, we have confirmed a hidden reservoir of stolen resonance beneath the hall, linked to altered dual notation and curse geometry. Also, by tomorrow morning, half the lower watch will believe the two of you are carrying on a dramatic feud flavored by mutual temptation. Seris closed her eyes briefly. Wonderful. It could be worse, Lynette said. How? I haven't thought of a way yet, but the night is young. Ivan sobered first. The sigils in that chamber matter more than the guards. If the same curse language was used there and on me, then whoever built the reservoir is not merely stealing power. He is refining a method. For what? Seris asked. He looked toward the lit upper stories of the Hall of Measures, where music still spilled from the festival chambers into the night. I don't know yet. But whatever it is, the white reed season is feeding it. The lantern procession chorus rose again from the riverside, bright and haunting. Seris followed the sound and thought of the basin below, filling with stolen civic light. When she turned back, Ivan was watching her, not with the theatrical intensity the gossips would have preferred, but with grave, searching attention. In the corridor, when she had pulled him close to save all three of them, there had been no time to think. Now the memory returned with unwelcome clarity, his hand at her waist, the startled warmth of him, the way his breath had caught as though he felt the same dangerous spark she had spent years training herself to master. She did not trust sparks. Sparks made people careless. And yet, you said a rivalry would make good cover, she said. It already has. Then we should use it thoroughly. Lynette looked from one to the other with immediate and indecent interest. I beg your pardon? Seris ignored her. If Ardyn or anyone in his circle wanted us in the same ceremonial orbit, let them think they have it. Public friction. Private access. We keep being seen near one another often enough to explain curiosity, but not enough to suggest alliance. Ivan understood at once. Training challenges. Yes. Sharpened remarks in public. Yes. Occasional visible offense. That should not strain you. That flicker of warmth returned to his mouth. No. I suppose not. Lynette clasped her hands. I would like it noted for history that I am opposed to any plan requiring me to watch the two of you pretend not to be intrigued by one another. We are not intrigued, Seris said. Of course, Lynette replied. Ivan, to his credit, did not help. The bells along the river rang the late hour. The festival lights moved across the water like loosened stars. Around them, Lythre kept celebrating, unknowing, while beneath its finest hall a stolen heart of magic brightened in the dark. Seris drew in a steadying breath. Tomorrow at dawn, she said. South Terrace Court. If we are to fake a rivalry, we should at least earn the quality of it. Ivan inclined his head. I'll be there. Then, more quietly, as Lynette bent over her copied keys and muttered about incompetent lock design, he added, thank you. For believing enough to look. Seris held his gaze for a moment longer than she should have. I have not decided how much I believe, she said. No, he replied, and the gentleness in his voice made the words feel like understanding rather than contradiction. But you came anyway. She turned before he could see how sharply that landed. At dawn the next morning, the South Terrace Court was washed in pale gold and river mist. Seris arrived first, as she always did. The city below had not yet fully woken. Bells were still quiet. Market shutters still closed. The world felt held between breaths. She began with footwork, then blade forms, then recovery turns. By the time she sensed him enter the court, her body was warm and her mind had nearly convinced itself that this would be simple. It was not simple. Ivan came without mask or flourish, carrying 2 practice blades wrapped in plain cloth. He set one on the rail for her and stepped into the court with the grave courtesy that had already begun to feel less like performance and more like his natural language. For a moment they only looked at one another in the quiet morning light. Then Seris took the offered blade. Try not to sing at me, she said. His eyes lit, just slightly. No promises. They saluted. And when steel met steel beneath the waking sky, their supposed rivalry began to acquire something far more dangerous than pretense. Not victory. Not surrender. Recognition. By the end of the week, Half the city believed Seris Vale and the Swan Knight could not endure the sight of one another. The other half believed precisely the opposite, but with enough romantic embroidery to make any sensible person leave the room. Seris endured both opinions with a composure that had become increasingly expensive to maintain. Their plan worked too well. Dawn training sessions on the South Terrace court were visible from 2 upper lanes, and no matter how early they met, someone always seemed to glimpse them. A servant carrying wash water, a baker's son delivering loaves, an apprentice duelist moving with suspicious quiet toward practice and then stalling outright to stare. By noon, whatever had been seen in fragments had expanded into rumor. The city delighted in their rivalry, the clipped remarks after exhibition bouts, the sharp-eyed exchanges in the Hall of Measures corridors, the fact that both seemed to be present whenever the other appeared. Seris had not intended to become part of anyone's entertainment. She also had not intended to look forward to dawn. Yet each morning, when the mist still clung low over the river and the white festival banners hung quiet before the day's wind arrived, she found him already waiting or arrived moments after, carrying practice blades wrapped in plain cloth and wearing the same grave courtesy as though the world beyond the court did not exist. They trained hard enough that no one could accuse them of idleness. Hard enough, too, that she did not have to think too often about the fact that she had begun to understand his body's rhythm almost as well as her own. The first morning, she had gone at him with all the irritation she could honestly summon and quite a bit more besides. He met it with precision and patience, never mocking, never showy. When she overcommitted to test his recovery, he answered with a soft yielding turn that redirected her without humiliating her. When he pressed, he did so with startling intelligence, always seeming to sense exactly how far he could go before force would become cruelty. By the third morning, Seris knew 2 things she did not previously know. First, Ivan Marceau was not only a remarkable duelist. He was a remarkable student. Second, she liked teaching him. The realization annoyed her. Again, she said, circling him under the thin gold light. His chest rose and fell evenly. A dark strand of hair had come loose near his temple. You say that with increasing menace. You keep repeating the same courtesy error. It is not courtesy. It is caution. It is reluctance. He lifted the practice blade into guard. Is there such a difference? Yes. She attacked without further warning. Their blades struck, slid, separated. Ivan gave ground a half-step, then turned her line aside and moved with the fluid, infuriating elegance that made bystanders sigh into their sleeves. Seris cut low, high, then changed tempo mid-turn. This time he answered correctly, anchoring his recovery instead of floating through it. Better, she said. You praise me like a magistrate approving bridge repairs. I have great faith in bridges. And very little in me. She drove him backward again before replying. My faith in you improves when you stop apologizing with your shoulders. That made him blink. She pressed once more, then broke away. You do it there. In the second beat. You expect your line to win, then regret it before it finishes. He lowered the blade slightly, eyes narrowed in thought. I did not know it showed. It shows to me. For a moment the quiet between them changed. The court, the dawn, the distant gull cry from the river, everything seemed to lean around those 3 words. It shows to me. Seris regretted the phrasing at once, not because it was untrue, but because it felt too much like intimacy. Ivan did not take advantage of it. He only inclined his head once, grave as always. Then I will correct it. She nodded and turned away under the pretense of adjusting her grip. He was easier to read now in motion than he had been at the exhibition. Not because he was careless. Because he trusted her enough to stop disguising every instinct. She had learned where hesitation entered his line when he feared hurting someone, how his right wrist stiffened if the curse had pulled too hard the night before, how the music-centered grace of his style became even more beautiful when he forgot he was being observed. In return, he had learned the architecture of her discipline, how she built sequences, how she hid fatigue behind immaculate posture, how her calm sharpened rather than softened when angered. He also had the irritating ability to notice what she did not say. On the 5th morning he arrived paler than usual. Most people would not have seen it. Seris did immediately. You lost sleep. He set the cloth-wrapped blades on the rail. A little. That is not an answer. A breath passed. He glanced toward the river, where the early light was still silvering the water. There was a civic oath rite in the North District after midnight. Small. Routine. But I felt the drain even from 2 streets away. Because of the reservoir. Yes. The word hung between them, neither of them needing to say what followed. Every rite in Lythre now fed the hidden basin under the Hall of Measures. Not just duels. Weddings. Oath-taking. Boundary charters. Public vows. The city's most trusted forms had become veins leading to a concealed heart of theft. Seris rested one hand on the rail. How bad? Ivan's expression tightened. Worse than before. When the siphoning grows stronger, the curse answers it. It recognizes the same language. She watched him carefully. And I woke half-shifted. A clean blade of cold went through her. He must have seen the change in her face, because he added at once, I am all right now. That is not the point. No, he said softly. It is not. She should have asked practical questions first. Instead, she heard herself say, were you alone? The answer came after the briefest hesitation. Yes. A strange, almost angry protectiveness rose in her chest. The image arrived unbidden, Ivan in some borrowed room, past midnight, the curse dragging at him while the city slept on under its banners and lanterns and festival songs. Alone. She turned from the rail. Show me the correction in the second beat. Perhaps he understood what she was doing, giving the conversation a frame sturdy enough to hold what could not yet be held directly. If he did, he accepted it without offense. They trained until the sun had fully cleared the eastern roofs and sweat dampened both their collars. By the end of the session, his shoulders no longer apologized when he struck. As they gathered the blades, he said, you are kinder than you believe. She fastened the cloth ties more tightly than needed. That is a strategically unsound opinion. It is still mine. She did not answer. Later that day, the white reed schedule drew them both back to the Hall of Measures for a sequence of lesser exhibition bouts and patron presentations, the sort of ceremonies that fed public appetite between the more important matches. Seris fought once and won cleanly against a visiting champion from the West Barges. Ivan fought later and won in a style so measured it left his opponent still dignified and the audience in even greater awe than before. The city, unsurprisingly, interpreted this mutual brilliance as evidence that destiny was arranging a rematch. Seris stood in one of the side corridors afterward, untying the laces at her wrist, when Auron Thale appeared with an expression of professionally managed distress. I am coming to warn you, he said, that you are now a subject of illustrated speculation. She stared at him. Explain. The pamphleteers in the lower market have begun producing festival sheets devoted exclusively to the question of whether your next bout with the Swan Knight will result in reconciliation, murder, or some artistically satisfying combination of the two. Seris looked briefly at the ceiling, as if asking the gods whether flood or fire would be more merciful. Auron continued, because he was incapable of leaving a wound untwisted if the humor justified it. My personal favorite depicts you both standing back to back on the roof of the hall while swans circle overhead and lightning emerges for no discernible reason. There has never been lightning in a sanctioned duel. Accuracy has suffered terribly. Despite herself, she almost smiled. Auron's expression sobered. Jests aside, I have something useful. The Chancellor is hosting a private reception tomorrow evening for select patrons, judges, and senior festival affiliates. Smaller than the public banquets. Tighter guest list. He has requested that both you and the Swan Knight attend. That ended any chance of smiling. Requested. Yes. Why? He claims he wishes to honor the season's most captivating duelists. Auron's tone suggested exactly what he thought of that phrasing. Unofficially, I suspect he wishes to watch the city's current obsessions at close range. Does he often summon duelists to his private rooms? Only when he believes proximity can be turned into advantage. Seris drew the last wrist lace free. Then we should attend. Auron blinked. You say that much too quickly for my comfort. Your comfort is rarely central to my plans. He sighed. I will have invitations delivered by sunset. Please do try not to stab anyone unless absolutely artistically necessary." When he left, Seris remained in the corridor a moment longer, considering. If Arden wanted them nearby, there was a reason. Either he suspected their growing scrutiny and wished to test them, or he intended to pull them closer into whatever machinery he was building. Perhaps both. Either way, refusing would serve him better than attending. A soft footstep sounded at the opposite end of the hall. She looked up. Ivan had appeared in the archway leading from the eastern gallery passage, still in festival whites, his gloves in one hand and his hair loosened by exertion. The corridor light gentled the angular planes of his face. When he saw her expression, some humor left his own. "What happened?" "Arden wants us at a private reception." His mouth flattened. "Tomorrow?" "Yes. I received the summons as I left the ring." Seris folded her loosened wrist wraps into a neat square. "Then he wants something. I doubt it is our company." "No." They fell into step together almost without discussion, moving toward the quieter garden court behind the southern annex where the servants rarely lingered during ceremonies. The space was enclosed by pale stone walls and a low reflecting pool ringed with dwarf reeds. Afternoon light lay across the surface in broken silver. Only when they were alone did Seris say, "Oren thinks Arden wants to observe us." That would fit him. Ivan sat on the low edge of the pool, not from weariness exactly, but as though standing under public scrutiny for too long had taken a subtler toll. He has sent messages before. Invitations to dine. To discuss my prospects in Lythre. To advise me on how the city rewards talent. Seris went still. "And you refused?" "Twice." The corner of his mouth shifted faintly. The third message came with the expedited exhibition petition. That sharpened everything. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I only understood the pattern after we found the reservoir." He looked down at his gloved hand. "At the time, I thought him merely another official with an appetite for novelty." "He is that," Seris said. "He is also something worse." A breeze moved over the pool, stirring the reeds. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ivan said, "There is more." Her attention sharpened at once. He did not look up. "After I arrived in Lythre, before the White Reed opening, I fought a verification bout in a private court arranged through the festival office. Harmless on the surface. A test of credentials. I won. The opponent was competent but not exceptional." His voice grew flatter, controlled. "When it ended, I nearly lost my footing. The drain was immediate. Different from the ordinary cost of a sanctioned match. Strong enough that I shifted in the coach on the way back to my rooms and barely recovered before dawn." Seris's hand tightened on the folded wraps. "And Arden's office arranged it?" "Yes." The pieces aligned with a cold inevitability she hated. The Chancellor had not merely facilitated Ivan's arrival. He had measured him. Tested how the curse reacted under his altered ceremonial conditions. Perhaps he still did not know every truth of the binding, but he knew enough to use it. "Then tomorrow evening is not an honor," she said. "No. It is an examination." "Yes." Seris began pacing once along the edge of the pool, slow and deliberate, the way she did when anger had nowhere immediate to go. "Good. Let him examine us." Ivan watched her. "You say that as if you intend violence." "I intend clarity. That is only marginally less alarming." She stopped and faced him. "If he has been studying your curse through the hall rites, I want proof strong enough to lay before someone who cannot be easily bought. Such people exist. A few. They are difficult, prideful, and usually over 60. He almost smiled. It vanished quickly. "How?" "By letting him think he has the advantage." She should perhaps have been more disturbed by how easily the strategy came. But dueling had taught her long ago that sometimes the cleanest path to truth was not direct attack. Sometimes one yielded, watched, and chose the line that exposed the center. He rose from the pool edge. "Then tomorrow we attend his reception, behave exactly as he expects, and see where he leads." "Yes." "And if he leads nowhere? Then we make him uncomfortable until he does." That earned the ghost of another smile. "I begin to understand why the city is afraid of you." "The city is not afraid of me." "It should be, a little." Before she could answer, footsteps sounded beyond the arch and Lythre strode in holding 2 rolled invitations in one hand and a rolled-up market pamphlet in the other. "They've added lightning," she announced without greeting. Seris closed her eyes. "Oren told you." "Oren showed me." Lythre unfurled the pamphlet with vicious delight. "I regret to inform you that the latest version of your public mythology has become artistically ambitious." Ivan accepted the sheet when she thrust it toward him and stared at it in baffled silence. Seris, against her better judgment, stepped closer to look. The illustration was absurd. She and Ivan stood on a stylized bridge in opposing dueling stances while giant swans wheeled through storm clouds above them and white reed petals swirled like snow. Beneath, in ornate script, ran the title, "The Swan Knight and the Silver Blade, Shall Rivalry End in Ruin?" There followed a speculative paragraph so florried that Lythre had already marked 3 phrases with offended ink. "I hate everyone," Seris said. "I know," Lythre replied. "It's one of your better qualities." Ivan looked up from the pamphlet, eyes alight with startled laughter he was trying, and failing, to suppress. "I do not understand why there is lightning." "There is never lightning," Seris said. "That is what I have been saying." Lythre handed over the invitations. "Private reception tomorrow, 8th bell, Chancellor's Riverside Wing. Formal attire, naturally. Also, I've done some hunting through archived council decrees and found something interesting." She lowered her voice. 3 years ago, Arden proposed expanding the legal role of ceremonial contests in contract enforcement and civic arbitration. It was opposed at first. Too expensive. Too theatrical. Then a string of smaller unrests in outer districts made the council desperate for public unity rituals. "And Arden offered duels as the answer," Seris said. "With musical enhancements. Larger audiences. More witness authority. More formal codification." Lythre's expression sharpened. If he has been designing a citywide net for collected resonance, he's been laying it for years. Ivan rolled the pamphlet closed. "Then the white reed season is only the culmination." "Yes," Lythre said. "And I think I know where he intends to spend it." Both of them turned toward her. She drew a breath. There is a dormant civic chamber beneath the Hall of Measures called the Vault of Accord. It was used generations ago during major succession disputes when multiple oath rights had to be harmonized at once. The old records say it can stabilize and redistribute enormous ceremonial charge enough to bind district wards and contract lattices all across Lythre in one sequence. Seris felt the implications immediately. If Arden filled that chamber with stolen resonance, he could yoke the city's ceremonial network to a new central authority. Ivan finished. Lythre nodded grimly. And if he wrote himself into the governing sigils, every future right might answer him first. A hard silence followed. At last Seris said, "Then we do not merely need proof. We need timing." "Yes. And we need to know when he intends to use the vault." Lythre tapped the invitations against her palm. "Private receptions are useful. Men like Arden enjoy speaking too confidently when surrounded by silk and admiration." Seris looked at the sealed card in her hand. "Tomorrow evening, chandeliers and polished silver, patron smiles and the river glittering beneath the Chancellor's private balconies." She had fought in armor and under witness, before crowds and under judgment. She trusted steel more than silk. But if Arden thought power lay in rooms built for display, then she would go into such a room and let him think her decorative. The thought was unpleasant. The purpose steadied it. "I'll attend," she said. Ivan inclined his head. "So will I." Lythre gave them each a measuring look and then, infuriatingly, softened. "Try not to be too obvious." Seris stared. "About what?" Lythre's expression became innocence itself. "About wanting to throttle one another." That should not have made Seris's pulse trip in the strange way it did. She blamed fatigue. The following evening, Chancellor Arden's private reception proved exactly the sort of event Seris disliked most, elegant enough to smother sincerity and intimate enough to make every conversation feel strategic. The riverside wing of his residence had been opened to the gardens, allowing the warm night air to drift through high-arched windows draped in pale silk. Lanterns hung from silver chains above polished mosaic floors. Musicians played softly from an alcove half hidden behind flowering orange trees in ceramic tubs. Beyond the terrace, the river moved black and luminous beneath strings of floating festival lights. Everything was arranged to suggest refinement without effort. Which meant, Seris thought, that a great deal of effort had been spent making it appear effortless. She wore a formal midnight blue gown cut simply at the throat and wrists, with silver embroidery echoing reed patterns at the hem. She had not chosen it. Dame Iselle had sent it with a note declaring that if Seris insisted on frightening society, she should at least do so beautifully. Pella had nearly levitated with triumph while helping fasten the sleeves. Now Seris stood near one of the terrace columns, accepting polite greetings from patrons and council affiliates while keeping her expression composed and her attention sharp. Ivan arrived 10 minutes later. He wore dark formal clothes rather than exhibition white, which turned out to be a far graver threat to composure than the mask had ever been. The cut was severe, the color nearly black, relieved only by a pale collar and the faint glint of silver at his cuffs. Without the public theatrics of festival costume, there was nothing to distract from the man himself. Too many people noticed at once. Seris resented them all on principle. He saw her across the room. The smallest acknowledgement passed between them, not intimacy, not distance, but something balanced precisely between. A duelist's salute translated into evening attire. Arden appeared shortly afterward, gliding through the gathering with the smooth assurance of a man who considered every guest another ornament placed correctly in a room. He was handsome in the polished way of court portraiture, with silver at his temples and a measured voice that never seemed to hurry for anyone. When he reached Seris, his smile conveyed exactly the right amount of public esteem. Lady Vale, he said, bowing over her hand without quite touching it. Lythre owes much of its present excitement to your skill. Excitement is a volatile debt, Seris replied. Only when badly directed. His eyes flicked, briefly and deliberately, toward Ivan on the far side of the room. I hope our festival has not wearied you with attention. I fight more comfortably than I socialize. A sentiment shared by many gifted people. He turned slightly, including the room without losing focus on her. I trust you find our guest challenger worthy of the city's interest. He is skilled. And intriguing. Seris met his gaze. Those are not the same thing. His smile did not falter, but something in it thinned. No, he said. Not always. Then he was gone to greet another guest, leaving behind the faint scent of cedar and calculation. A quarter-hour later, Seris found herself on the river terrace beside a table of cut crystal and untouched fruit when Ivan joined her beneath the hanging lanterns. Beyond the balustrade, music drifted over black water. He is watching us in mirrors, Ivan said quietly. Seris did not look toward the mirrors. Of course he is. He tried to ask whether I find Lythre hospitable. And I told him your city has a great respect for disciplined violence. That surprised a short breath of laughter from her before she could stop it. His expression softened at the sound. There. I had wondered whether you could still do that. Do what? Laugh. I do not do it often. No, his voice gentled further. You should. The night, the river, the private terrace, the low music, all of it conspired to make the moment feel more dangerous than it had any right to be. Seris turned slightly toward the balustrade. Did he say anything useful? He asked whether the exhibition drain had troubled me. Her head came around sharply. In those words? Not precisely. But close enough. Ivan rested one hand lightly on the stone rail. He framed it as concern. Suggested that visiting duelists sometimes find Lythre's ceremonial force overwhelming. That is not concern. That is measurement. Yes. Did you answer? I told him I have endured more difficult bindings. This time she did not hide the cold in her face. And how did he receive that? He smiled as though I had confirmed a theory. The lantern light moved over the river below them, wavering gold. Seris could feel the entire evening tightening toward something. Then he knows enough to be dangerous, she said. He always was. Before she could answer, voices rose from the inner chamber. Arden had gathered a small circle near the central mosaic: judges, 2 senior patrons, 1 councillor from the bridge ward, and Oren Thale, who looked as though he would rather have been handling live coals. "Friends," Arden was saying with genial ease, "I had hoped to offer our guests a glimpse of a little restoration project beneath the Hall of Measures. A humble thing, really. An old civic chamber being prepared for renewed service. Lythre's traditions deserve not only preservation, but strengthening." Seris's attention sharpened to a blade point. A judge asked, "You mean the old vault?" Arden spread his hands modestly. "In due time. Once its harmonics are properly stabilized." The bridge counselor laughed. "You and your harmonics, Chancellor. Soon you'll have us believing music rules the law." "Not rules," Arden said smoothly. "Supports. All authority requires resonance if it is to endure." He did not look toward Seris or Ivan as he said it, which made the sentence worse. The guests murmured approval. Restoring an old civic chamber sounded admirable, traditional, patriotic. No one in that circle knew there was a basin of stolen ceremony already pulsing beneath their feet. Seris kept her expression still with effort. Ivan's voice came low beside her. "He is too comfortable." "Yes. He wants us to hear this." "Yes." She understood the move then. Arden was not merely boasting. He was baiting. Suggesting without declaring. Offering enough truth to test whether either of them reacted like people who knew more than they should. So Seris did what he least expected. She stepped away from the balustrade, turned toward the light, and approached the gathering with perfectly measured composure. The circle opened for her instinctively. Arden's eyes touched her face, unreadable. "Chancellor," she said, "I hope your restoration is less disruptive than your recent score revisions." A tiny silence dropped. One of the patrons laughed, assuming wit. Oren, from across the circle, went very still. Arden smiled. "You disapprove of refinement. I disapprove of altering structures that are not understood merely because they look more impressive afterward." The patrons' laugh died. Arden's voice remained warm. "And yet dueling itself is a living form, Lady Vale. Surely a master such as you appreciates adaptation. When adaptation strengthens integrity, yes." She held his gaze. "When it weakens balance, no." For a heartbeat, the air in the circle seemed to contract. Then Arden inclined his head with gracious ease, as though nothing at all had happened. "A fair caution. Perhaps when the festival quiets, you might advise me on where balance is best preserved." "I would be delighted," Seris said. She could almost hear Oren's soul leaving his body somewhere near the mosaic. Only when she withdrew again to the terrace did her pulse quicken. Ivan joined her moments later. That was reckless. It was precise. It was both. She looked out over the river so she would not have to meet the concern in his face. "He wanted to see whether I would flinch. I preferred to let him know I bite." A pause. Then, very quietly, "I know." She turned then, because the tone had changed. It was not humor. Not warning. Something else. He was closer than before. Not improper, not touching, but close enough that the lantern light caught in the gray of his eyes and turned them almost silver. "What?" she asked, more softly than intended. "That you bite," he said. "I know." No one had ever said something so nearly affectionate to her in so calm a voice. No one, perhaps, had ever looked at her with such open regard while doing it. Seris had faced cheering galleries, furious challengers, patrons, magistrates, and steel. None had ever made it so difficult to remember how to breathe. A servant came onto the terrace with fresh glasses just then, and the moment broke like a spell under daylight. Later, as the reception thinned and guests drifted toward departure, Oren managed to corner Seris near the outer hall. "You cannot continue speaking to the Chancellor like that unless you intend to marry either danger or catastrophe," he muttered. "I had not realized they were separate houses. This is not amusing." "It almost is." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I heard enough to know that he heard enough. And he has ordered tomorrow's high exhibition re-sequenced again. Final pairing yet to be announced." Seris's attention sharpened at once. "Why tell me?" "Because I've reached the point in this season where self-preservation begins to look like honesty." He lowered his voice further. I also found a requisition slip routed through the lower hall offices for additional witness braziers and reinforced subfloor chimes, all to be installed before tomorrow's ceremony. No one upgrades understructures for an ordinary exhibition. He's preparing another draw, she said. Yes. Who fights? Oren's expression turned grim. That is the problem. The pairing seal has not yet been posted, but the rehearsal cards were stacked in the marshal's room by title. He hesitated. One of them read Swan Knight. The cold returned, deeper than before. When Seris found Ivan again in the carriage court, the first guests were already departing in a line of lantern-lit vehicles. He saw her face and all semblance of evening ease left his own. What is it? Tomorrow's exhibition is being altered for another siphon draw. Your title is on the rehearsal cards. He absorbed that in silence. Then Arden means to use me again. Yes. And perhaps you with me. She thought of the hall, of their exhibition match, of the way the gathered resonance had plunged downward at the exact moment of his victory. Perhaps not even perhaps. The carriage court around them filled with layered sound, horses shifting, servants calling, wheels over stone. Yet within that noise, a sharper stillness opened between them. I told you the curse worsened when the city drains rise, Ivan said quietly. Yes. There is more I have not said. He looked out toward the line of departing carriages, not at her. When the binding is pushed too hard, it does not only pull at my shape. It urges compulsion. Seris held still. What kind? To win. At any cost. To answer any contest as if survival depends on conquest. His hands had gone rigid at his sides. Most of the time I can master it. But yesterday morning, after the midnight oathrite, I nearly struck a man in the lane for jostling my shoulder. I had to leave before I understood why my pulse was climbing. The confession landed with terrible force because she knew how much shame it cost him to speak it. You did leave, she said. Yes. You mastered it. For now. He turned to her then, and the honesty in his face was almost unbearable. If Arden is deliberately feeding the same language that sustains the curse, then tomorrow he may be trying to force me into a state where mastery fails. Seris did not think. She stepped closer. The lanterns along the court picked silver out of the braid at her sleeve and pale fire from the edges of his collar. Around them, servants moved and carriages rolled, but no one seemed near enough to matter. You listen to me, she said, and her own voice had gone low and fierce without permission. You are not the curse. You are not whatever compulsion it throws against your ribs in borrowed words. If he thinks he can use you as a blade and call it destiny, he is wrong. Something in Ivan's face changed, sudden and raw. No one had ever told him that, she realized. Or not often enough to survive in memory. His answer came rougher than usual. Seris. A footman passed near them and forced a half-step of distance. The moment held anyway. We train at dawn, she said, because anything else would have been too much. Yes. And tomorrow, whatever pairing he announces, we meet it together. His gaze locked with hers. Together. It was not a lover's vow. Not yet. It felt like one all the same. Dawn came grey and cool, the river hidden under a long veil of mist that made the city's lower bridges seem to float. Seris reached the South Terrace court to find Ivan already there, but not alone. Mother Eloan Maya stood near the rail in a dove-grey cloak, one hand resting on the carved stone as if greeting an old friend. Her hair, more silver than black now, was braided with reed thread and tiny white shells. She turned at Seris's approach, and her gaze, calm, clear, impossibly steady, took in everything at once. Lady Vale, she said. Seris halted. She had seen the shrine keeper only once before, years ago, during a public blessing at the riverside sanctuary. Even then, Eloan had seemed like someone standing slightly nearer to older laws than most other people did. I did not expect company. No, Eloan said, and a glimmer of humor touched her eyes. Few useful things do. Ivan looked as if he had not slept much. I sent for her before dawn. Because of the compulsion? Seris asked. Yes. Mother Eloan stepped nearer. Because the white reed season is no longer merely ceremonial, she said. It is beginning to speak in the language of old binding. And because this young man has carried his curse alone longer than wisdom would advise. Seris glanced at Ivan. He did not deny it. You know the nature of it, she asked Eloan. I know enough. The older woman's gaze moved to the eastern mist over the river. Swanblood responds to witness and vow more deeply than most shifter lines. Whoever bound him did not invent a curse from nothing. They twisted existing truths. Those are the hardest bindings to break. That is not comforting, Seris said. Comfort is not always the first mercy. Eloan asked Ivan for his hand. He gave it without hesitation. She touched 2 fingers lightly to his wrist, then closed her eyes. The court fell still. Even the morning gulls seemed farther away. After a few breaths, she opened her eyes again. Yes, she said softly. It is entangled with the hall. More deeply now than before. Can it be severed? Seris asked. Eloan looked at her directly. Every false binding may be severed. But not always by force. Ivan's mouth tightened. Then by what? By truth spoken in the place where the lie was enthroned. By refusal. By cost freely chosen. Her gaze gentled. A curse fed by coerced victory does not fear strength most. It fears the moment someone values another law above survival. The words went through Seris like a struck note. Ivan looked away toward the mist, as if the shape of that answer frightened him more than any harder instruction would have. Mother Eloan released his wrist. I cannot break it here. Not yet. But I can tell you this, the compulsion is not your deepest nature. It is only the sharpest hook set in it. Do not mistake the one for the other. He bowed his head once. Thank you. Eloan drew her cloak closer. When today's exhibition is called, watch not only the blades, but the pattern around them. The city is being taught a lie about power. You will need to answer with something true. She took her leave with the same quiet dignity with which she had arrived, descending the terrace steps into the waking mist until she seemed less to depart than to be gathered by the morning. For a long moment after, neither Seris nor Ivan spoke. At last Seris said, Did you know she would say something like that? No. Good. He glanced at her, some tired warmth returning despite everything. Why good? Because if you had, I would have accused you of staging prophecy. That drew a real laugh from him, brief but genuine, and the sound eased something in her chest she had not known was clenched. They trained then, not fiercely at first, but with a different kind of intensity. Less about defeating. More about listening. Seris could feel the shift in him from the first crossed blade. He was still carrying the tension of the coming day, yet there was new steadiness under it, as though Eloan's words had given him a place to set some part of the burden down. At one point, midway through a close exchange, Seris changed angle and their practice blades locked near the hilt. Their faces were suddenly close. Too close for comfort if comfort had ever been the purpose of this. Too close, too, for indifference. Ivan's breath caught first. So did hers. Neither moved. Morning mist curled through the court beyond them. Somewhere below, the first market bells began to ring. The world should have widened with those sounds. Instead it narrowed. He could have stepped back. So could she. Neither did. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I am trying very hard to be honorable. The words were so unexpected that for a moment she only stared at him. Then, helplessly, that seems unlike you to say aloud. A faint, aching smile touched his mouth. It seemed only fair to warn you. The locked blades trembled between them from the small strain of holding still. Warn me of what? She asked, and knew, even before he answered, that she was no longer asking about training. His eyes searched hers with such open care it almost undid her. That I do not think of you as a rival when we are alone. The court seemed to tilt. Seris had spent years mastering composure. She knew how to stand under praise, scrutiny, victory, defeat, and insult without letting herself be read. But no discipline she possessed had prepared her for tenderness offered this plainly. She should have said something measured. Something sensible. Instead, the truth escaped. I have not for some time. Silence. Then the practice blade in Ivan's hand loosened just enough that the tension between the weapons eased. Not distance. Surrender of a different sort. He drew back first, but only by the breath required for propriety to survive. Seris. The shout from below cut across the moment like a thrown knife. Posting at the hall, a boy's voice rang up from the lower street. High exhibition pairings posted. The morning rushed back in around them. Seris stepped away, pulse uneven now for reasons wholly unrelated to combat. Ivan lowered his blade. For a heartbeat, both looked as if they had been awakened from something perilously like peace. Then training, revelation, and the near confession all had to be folded away beneath practical action. Seris set the blade back on the rail. We should go. Yes. Neither mentioned what had passed between them. Neither forgot it. The crowd outside the Hall of Measures was thicker than usual for a mid-morning posting. Apprentices, patron servants, street bettors, and professional gossips packed the square around the public board, craning for sight. White banners snapped above them in the rising wind. Market sheets were already changing hands. Somebody had brought sugared swan buns again, which Seris considered an offense punishable by exile. Oren stood near the board with the expression of a man who had personally lost an argument with fate. When Seris and Ivan approached, the press shifted to let them through, murmuring audibly. Rivalry or no rivalry, the city knew drama when it saw it. Seris read the pairing seal. Her blood went cold. The high exhibition was not a common festival match. It was an officially sanctioned right of continuance, an older ceremonial form rarely used outside succession disputes or sacred civic renewals. More witness phrases. More formal resonance. More public binding authority. And the paired duelists named at its center were Seris Vale. The Swan Knight. Side by side. Not opponents in separate matches. A paired right. A duel of joined pattern against rotating challengers chosen by festival lot. The square around them roared with delighted confusion. The city would love the novelty of its supposed rivals forced into shared sequence before the entire hall. They would call it ingenious, dramatic, irresistible. Seris saw only the trap. A paired right required synchronized movement, shared witness geometry, and linked ceremonial charge. If Arden wanted to test how the reservoir answered Ivan's curse and how Seris's formal mastery could stabilize or amplify it, he could hardly have chosen a more dangerous frame. Oren stepped forward before the crowd pressed too close. I am sorry, he said under his breath. I argued. I lost. Who requested this form? Seris asked. He did not need to answer. Arden himself emerged from the hall doors above the steps, smiling into the noise as if delighted by the public excitement he had engineered. His gaze found them at once. Found their names side by side on the board. Found, perhaps, the brief stillness in both their faces before discipline returned. Then he inclined his head from the top step in a gesture that could be read by the crowd as honor. By Seris, it read as challenge. Beside her, Ivan had gone motionless in the way he did when holding too many forces in check at once. A paired right. Linked resonance. Public witness. Curse language woven into the city's foundations. Arden had arranged not merely another siphon, but a deliberate entangling of their fates before all of Lythre. Seris folded her hands once to keep them still. Then she looked at Ivan. He looked back. And because of everything that had passed in the garden court, on the dawn terrace, in the undervault, and between locked practice blades in the mist, the glance carried more than alarm. It carried promise. Whatever Arden meant to make of them, he would not face them divided. The bells above the hall began to ring, announcing the coming right to the city. And somewhere deep below the stone, hidden from every cheering voice in the square, the stolen reservoir waited. The bells for the right of continuance rang all afternoon. Lythre received the announcement as it received all public spectacle, with delight sharpened by argument. By midday, every market lane had taken sides over what the pairing meant. Some declared it an inspired gesture of civic unity, proof that the white reed season meant to reconcile two brilliant adversaries through artistry. Others insisted the council had devised the arrangement to provoke fresh scandal. By evening, the pamphleteers had abandoned even the pretense of restraint. A new sheet showed Seris and the Swan Knight crossing blades over a basin of moonlight while a chorus of swans looked on with solemn approval. Seris would have burned them all if fire did not spread so quickly in old river cities. Instead, she spent the afternoon in motion. Motion gave shape to fury. Motion made thought usable. She met Lythre in the Music Guild Annex, Oren in a side corridor of the hall, Mela in the South Practice Yard, and each conversation tightened the same intolerable knot. The right of continuance was no whimsical exhibition. Its old function had been sacred civic transfer, shared burden, witnessed accord, the temporary joining of two distinct patterns so a greater structure could be renewed. In ordinary times, it was beautiful. In corrupted hands, it was a harvesting knife. Lythre spread 3 copied folios over the annex table, flattening them with such force the inkwells rattled. "Look here," she said, stabbing at the notation. "The outer pattern is traditional enough to pass a glance test. The paired geometry is real. The witness sequence is mostly authentic. But the lower harmonic repeat has been altered again, and again, and again." She pointed lower. "He's built an echo chamber into the score. Every linked movement will ring twice. Once in the hall. Once below. In the reservoir," Seris said. "Yes. And if 2 duelists are joined within the right." Lythre looked grim. "Then their resonant signatures braid. Not permanently, not if the right is clean. But for the duration? Enough for transfer." Seris understood. "Enough for Arden to see how my formal control and Ivan's curse answer one another." "Yes," Lythre said. "And perhaps enough to use one to stabilize the other while he drains both." The thought was so carefully monstrous that for a moment, Seris could only stand there with her hands braced on the table's edge. When she found Oren later near the marshal's office, his usually easy face had acquired the strained pallor of a man who had spent the day politely lying to too many important people. "I got into the lower filing chamber," he said in a voice barely above breath. "Not because I am brave. Because I have reached that curious stage of panic where bad ideas begin to look efficient. And I found restricted requisitions for additional witness braziers, subfloor chimes, and 1 sealed ceremonial relay keyed to the vault of accord." Seris held his gaze. "The vault." He nodded once. "Whatever Arden means to do, tonight's rite is not the culmination. It is calibration. The major chamber sequence is scheduled for the Solstice Championship 3 nights from now." Her mind moved at once. White Reed Tournament. Final match. Whole city gathered. Maximum witness. Maximum emotional charge. The reservoir full. The old vault keyed and waiting. "The final match," she said. "He means to use the final match to bind the city. That is my fear." Oren looked down the corridor to make sure no one approached. "And Lady Vale, your names being paired tonight may not only be because of public interest. It isn't." No, his face tightened. The lower notes in the relay file listed one resonant category as transformational anomaly. Cold passed cleanly through her. "Ivan." "Yes. And the other?" Oren swallowed. "Judicial harmonic anchor." Seris's jaw set. "Me. Likely. Your style is exact enough that half the city thinks you were born from the hall's own floor lines. That is flattering and offensive. Take it up with civic myth once the city survives." Mela was harder to find and harder to move. She found him in the South Yard drilling tavern so ruthlessly the younger man looked 2 exchanges from collapse. At sight of Seris, Mela dismissed his student with a curt motion and waited until they were alone. "Well," he said. "He's using the paired right to test a larger sequence in the vault on Solstice." Mela's mouth hardened, though not with surprise. "I assumed as much." "You assumed." "I trained duelists, not clerks. I have little proof and too many suspicions. You, at least, have gone and found trouble properly." She almost smiled, but it did not stay. "I may need to enter the right. That was never in doubt. Even knowing it is a trap. Especially then. If you do not, he will recalibrate and hide the weakness before Solstice." Mela crossed his arms. "You have always been better at fighting inside a problem than around it." "That sounds like condemnation." "It is both condemnation and praise. You know me." She did. He studied her face for a long moment. "What is the real question?" She did not answer immediately. At last, if the rite begins drawing through Ivan's curse, I may have to break sequence in public. Mailer's expression shifted. Break sequence how? I do not yet know. You hate uncertainty. Yes. And him? He asked, with such bluntness that it felt like a strike. Seris looked at him sharply. Mailer did not look away. You do not lose composure for trifles. You do not redraw your whole understanding of civic structure for strangers. If the question beneath all this is whether you are willing to ruin your standing for him, then at least ask it honestly. The yard felt abruptly too still. Seris turned her gaze toward the far rail where Tavin, pretending not to watch, was very obviously watching. She waited until the boy had the sense to vanish around the post. At last she said, I have not decided what I am willing to ruin. Mailer's voice softened by a degree so small few others would have noticed it. Decide before the floor asks. Dusk came with river mist and a hall full of people. The rite of continuance was posted for the 9th bell, giving the city all evening to gather and gossip and pour itself toward the Hall of Measures in layered waves of anticipation. Lanterns glowed in every arch, reed garlands had been freshened. The witness braziers burned with pale silver fire that made the polished floor lines gleam like submerged moonlight. Seris entered through the western passage in formal rite attire, not her usual dueling coat, but the older paired ceremony dress of dark-fitted layers under a sleeveless over-tabard marked with silver oathwork at the hem. The garment left freedom for movement while declaring publicly that she entered not a contest of private honor, but a civic form older than reputation. Ivan waited within. He wore the corresponding Eastern version in white and ash gray, no mask now, no public mystery left between them, only the grave beauty of a man who had become more exposed with every truth he told. The room's quiet lamps caught at the tiredness beneath his eyes. He had slept little, she knew it before he spoke. Yet he stood with careful steadiness, hands at his sides, as if holding himself human by will alone. For a moment the bustle outside the preparation chamber disappeared. There was only the two of them, the old rite garments, the knowledge that in minutes they would step into a corrupted ceremonial form before half the city. You should not have to do this tonight, Seris said. He looked at her, and some faint warmth moved behind the strain in his face. Neither should you. That is not an answer. No, he said quietly. It isn't. He drew a breath. The curse has been restless since sunset. It knows the rite before we enter it. A knot pulled low in her chest. How strong? Strong enough that if Arden wanted a reaction, he has one already. She stepped closer before thinking better of it. Then we keep the sequence tight. No improvisation unless necessary. If the draw begins, I know. No, she said, more sharply. You do not get to spare me clarity. If the draw begins, you tell me. A flicker, pain, affection, something too tender for the hour, passed through his expression. Seris. Tell me. He held her gaze, then nodded once. I will. Outside, the herald's bell sounded first assembly. Still they did not move. Perhaps it was the right garments. Perhaps the knowledge of the trap. Perhaps the days of dawn practice, corridor conspiracies, and truth spoken too softly to survive daylight. Whatever the reason, the space between them felt thinner than it had any right to. His voice lowered. If tonight goes badly, it won't. If it does. She looked straight at him. Then we walk out of the wreckage and continue being inconvenient. That startled a breath of laughter from him, brief and fragile and so beloved that it made her chest ache. He reached up then, slowly enough that she could have stopped him, and adjusted the fastening at her shoulder where the silver clasp sat fractionally misaligned. His fingers brushed the fabric, not her skin, yet the gesture felt more intimate than any touch she had known. There, he said. Her pulse betrayed her so completely she hoped the noise in the corridor covered it. The second bell rang. Together they stepped into the light. The hall received them like weather. Applause rose first, then the collective hush that always followed when spectacle turned serious. The octagonal arena had been transformed for the rite. The usual center lines remained, but now an interwoven figure of silver and pearl inlay joined the two entry arcs into one converging pattern. Additional witness braziers burned at each point, pale flames answering one another across the floor. The musicians' ensemble was doubled. The crowd filled every gallery and alcove, a living wall of attention. Oren stood below the judge's bench in full herald mantle, and though his face remained composed, Seris saw the tension at the corners of his mouth. He did not wish to speak this right. He would speak it perfectly. Arden sat in the high gallery near the central civic standard, not beside the judges but slightly above and behind them, the placement of a man who preferred power to appear advisory while functioning as command. His gaze rested on the arena with leisurely interest. Seris and Ivan descended to opposite marks and saluted the bench, the witnesses, and then each other. The moment their ritual gestures aligned, Seris felt it. Not the ordinary rise of resonance from a public form, beautiful and strong and clean. This was deeper, stranger. The rite recognized them as a joined pattern and pulled that recognition through the floor as though something beneath the hall had opened its mouth. Oren began the invocation. The old words of continuance filled the chamber: shared burden, witnessed accord, strength born in harmony so the greater whole might endure. In any honest ceremony, the phrasing would have moved Seris. Tonight it made her furious. The first rotating challengers entered a matched pair from two noble schools chosen for technical polish rather than brute force. The rite's form was simple in theory and demanding in practice. Seris and Ivan would fight side by side against sequential pairs, never competing against each other, their synchronized movement itself forming the civic symbol under witness. They had trained enough to know how their lines complemented. They had not trained under a thief's floor. The opening exchange began. Seris moved first on instinct and discipline: left line, pivot, clear the center. Ivan answered in perfect time, his blade turning the second challenger's advance into a measured arc that fed directly into her recovery. The hall inhaled around them. To any watching eye, it must have looked exquisite. Rival legends forced into partnership and somehow made more beautiful by it. To Seris, it felt like standing inside a bell someone else was striking. Each joined movement sent a doubled pulse downward. She felt it in her knees through the floor, in the ache at the base of her throat, in the near-silent answering hum of the silver inlay underfoot. The musician's score swelled and echoed. The lower braziers brightened unnaturally. They won the first sequence cleanly. The crowd erupted. The second pair entered. This time the pull was stronger. At the third exchange, Ivan's timing faltered by less than half a breath. No one in the gallery would have seen it. Seris did. She turned her own line wider to cover the slip, touched one challenger aside, and in the same motion came near enough to murmur without moving her lips, "Tell me." His answer came between strikes. "Not yet. Liar." The sequence ended. Applause. Witness phrase. Music shifted. The third pair were heavier fighters, festival favorites built for forceful passes and dramatic recoveries. Arden had chosen cleverly, enough skill to make the sequence believable, not enough to threaten the real purpose. Seris parried hard, turned, felt the right drag through her spine. Ivan answered too sharply, too much force, too fast, the first sign that the curse's compulsion had begun to answer the hall. One challenger stumbled under the unexpected pressure and nearly lost his weapon. The audience thrilled at the intensity. Seris did not. She stepped inside the next beat and deliberately collided shoulder to shoulder with Ivan under cover of recovering line, using the contact to jolt his rhythm. His eyes flashed to hers. "Stay with me," she whispered. "I am trying." The rawness in it cut deeper than if he had sounded afraid. They completed the third sequence. The hall rang with approval. The witness braziers flared white. From the high gallery, Arden did not applaud. He only watched. The fourth pair entered, and the rite began to turn dangerous. Seris felt the reservoir below them as a near-physical presence now, full and eager and drawing harder with each pass. The old continuance pattern should have distributed strain between the joined duelists, allowing one to cover the other's brief weakness and create a whole greater than its parts. Arden's alterations had perverted that logic. Instead of distributing burden, the floor concentrated it wherever the pair's lines harmonized most fully. On paper, that meant beauty. In practice, it meant Ivan. His curse responded to witness, transformation, victory, and forced accord. Each time their joined pattern reached perfect balance, The floor chose his resonance as the deeper channel and tried to drag through it. She saw it happen in real time. His movement went more fluid, not less, his style sharpening into something almost unbearably graceful. The crowd gasped at the beauty of it. Seris saw the cost. His pupils had widened. His face had gone pale beneath the hall light. At the end of one sequence, his left hand trembled once before he closed it. Enough. The witnesses called for the fifth and final pair. Seris lifted her blade into ready guard and made her choice. When the sequence began, she broke the expected tempo by a hair. Not enough for the judges to protest. Enough that Ivan had to answer her rather than the floor. He did, instinctively. Good. On the second beat, she altered angle again, disrupting the perfect harmonic symmetry Arden wanted. The draw underfoot snarled, missed clean purchase, and surged sideways through the lower braziers, which flared so brightly several spectators cried out. The challengers hesitated. Arden leaned forward in his seat. Seris pressed the opening at once, driving one challenger out of line. Ivan caught the other and turned him cleanly away. 4-3 heartbeats, the sequence became a real fight instead of a ritual siphon. Seris almost felt hope. Then the floor answered. A pulse surged up through the silver inlay with enough force to shiver the whole arena. One of the witness chimes cracked. Music staggered half a note. Ivan froze. Not stillness by choice. Stillness imposed. Seris heard his breath catch like pain. His blade dipped. Under the hall light, white edged the fingers of his right hand, not glove, not reflection, but feathering. Brief. Terrible. Gone almost at once, but real. She moved without thought, stepping across sequence to take the strike meant for him on her own blade. The impact rang up her arm hard enough to numb the shoulder. Gasps broke from the audience. The challengers recoiled. Oren's voice rose, trying to hold the right together with witness phrasing even as the hall's harmony threatened to tear. Ivan's face had gone stricken with horror. Seris. Finish it, she said. He did because he had no choice. The final pair were dispatched in two brilliant, brutal passes that looked to the crowd like the triumphant climax of a difficult rite. When the last weapon struck the floor and rolled away, the hall exploded into applause so loud it seemed to shake the chandeliers. Seris lowered her blade with iron control. Beside her, Ivan was barely holding human shape. No one else knew it yet. No one in the galleries saw the rigidness in his shoulders for what it was, or the pain beneath the beauty of his final lines. They saw only the city's two brightest duelists completing a sacred civic form under strain and emerging victorious. Arden rose in the high gallery and led the applause. Seris looked up at him. He smiled. The judges declared the rite fulfilled. Oren somehow spoke the closing without his voice breaking. The musicians, pale and shaken, resolved the final chord. White reed petals fell from the upper gallery in a late, disordered shower that no one had properly cued. Seris saluted once because the floor still required it. Then she turned, took Ivan by the wrist beneath the guise of formal withdrawal, and pulled him through the western passage before anyone could stop them. The preparation corridor was blessedly dim after the arena. Their footsteps echoed. Servants called farther off. Somewhere a marshal argued about a broken chime. None of it mattered. The moment they passed the last curtain, Ivan staggered. Seris caught him before he hit the wall. For one suspended instant all her control abandoned her. His weight half fell against her, his breath ragged at her throat, his body shaking with an effort no human should have had to make. "Look at me," she said. He tried. His eyes had gone wrong, still grey, still his, but ringed with something wild and white bright at the edges. "I hurt you," he whispered. The words struck harder than any blade. "No. I nearly." No, she caught his face between both hands so he could not turn away. "You stayed. You heard me. You came back." Feathering showed again at the edge of his collar, quick and vanished, but enough to freeze the blood in her. Footsteps approached. Seris swore softly and turned. Lythre appeared first, skirts gathered, Oren behind her, both looking more alarmed than ceremony allowed. The hall's half a breath from panic, Lythre said, then saw Ivan properly and stopped dead. "Oh." Oren shut the corridor door behind them at once. The judges think the flare was a harmless overcharge. Arden is assuring everyone that old forms are temperamental under revival. Liar, Seris said. Yes, Oren replied, too tired to make it elegant. Lynette came closer, all briskness replaced by sharp concern. Can he move? I can, Ivan said, though the words cost him. He tried to straighten and failed. Seris refused to let go. We need Mother alone, Lynette said. No, Ivan managed. Not the shrine. Too far. Oren looked between them. Then where? Ivan closed his eyes once, fighting for coherence. North Lake Chapel. Old Reed Sanctuary near the river turn. It still answers Swan-Song law. Seris did not wait for debate. Then we go now. The escape from the hall would have been impossible in ordinary circumstances. Tonight the right flare had turned the building inside out. Marshals ran messages, musicians argued over cracked instruments, stewards soothed alarmed patrons, and everyone from the chancellor downward labored to call the disturbance meaningful instead of dangerous. Oren used that chaos with a herald's ruthless practicality, clearing a side passage and redirecting one suspicious guard with a lie about burnt wiring. Lynette produced a servant's cloak from somewhere incomprehensible and threw it over Ivan's shoulders. Seris took his weight without comment and guided him out through the west colonnade into the night. The city beyond still celebrated. That was the cruelest part. Lanterns floated on the river. Market songs rose warm from the lower squares. White banners moved in the evening wind. Lythre glowed with festival faith while one of its truest men struggled to remain himself under magic stolen from its own rituals. They kept to the quieter lanes, Oren scouting ahead, Lynette muttering imprecations at every loose stone that slowed them. Seris said little. She was too busy listening to Ivan's breathing, too aware of every shudder he tried to hide. At the chapel path above the north bend, Mother Eloan was waiting. Seris had not sent word. None of them had. Yet the shrine keeper stood at the reed-fringed entrance with a lamp in one hand and did not look surprised. Bring him in, she said. The chapel was small and old, built half over the river edge on white posts darkened by time. Reed carvings framed the doorway. Within, the air smelled of wax, clean water, and something older birdsong remembered in wood. Moonlight came through the narrow windows in silver bars. They settled Ivan on the low stone platform before the central basin. The moment he crossed fully into the sanctuary, the tension in his body changed. Not gone. Named. Mother Eloan set the lamp beside him and laid her palm lightly against his sternum. Her eyes closed. The basin's water trembled. The rite forced the binding outward, she said after a moment. More than before. Seris stood a pace away, hands still cold from holding him. Can you stop it? For tonight, perhaps. Eloan opened her eyes and looked straight at Seris. For all nights. Not here. She asked Lynette and Oren to wait outside and, after one look at Seris's face, included her in the silence that followed. The chapel door closed softly behind the others. Only then did Ivan speak again, voice frayed nearly to breaking. I almost struck through you. You didn't. I wanted to, for one heartbeat. Shame flooded every syllable. Not because it was you. Because the curse saw obstacle and answered. I felt it happen. Seris's chest ached with a force that made anger feel too small. And still you stopped. With your help. With yours. Mother Eloan listened without interruption. At last she said, this is the truth of it, then. The binding no longer merely feeds on sanctioned victory. It is being amplified by the city's altered rites. Each time he enters a corrupted ceremonial field, the curse is taught that domination is survival. Ivan bowed his head. Then by solstice it may own me. No, Eloan said, sudden steel under the gentleness. Not if you remember the deeper law. His laugh was almost broken. I am trying. I know. But trying alone will not be enough now. Her gaze shifted to Seris. Neither of you has much time. Seris stepped nearer the basin. Tell us plainly. Eloan looked from one to the other, as if deciding whether they could bear the whole shape of the answer. The curse was built by twisting an old swanblood vow, she said. Those vows bind form not to conquest, but to chosen witness. To be seen truly and still remain. Whoever shaped the false version inverted that law. He tied human continuance to victorious performance under public sanction. Win, and be allowed selfhood a little longer. Lose, and be diminished. Ivan's hands curled against the stone. Eloan continued. That is why the curse responds so violently now to Arden's rights. He is feeding it with ceremonial language of accord, witness, and continuity, but all through theft and coercion. The lie becomes louder each time: survive by winning, remain human by conquering, endure by making another yield. And to break it? Seris asked. Eloan's eyes were very clear. A false law breaks when its victim freely chooses the true one at cost. Silence. The basin water shivered again, reflecting moonlight across the chapel ceiling like restless wings. Ivan spoke first, very quietly. Meaning I must refuse victory. Yes. In public. Yes. When the curse demands it most. Yes. He closed his eyes. Then it may kill me. It may, Eloan said. Or it may only threaten to. False bindings are loudest when they are weakest. Seris hated the calm with which this was spoken. You're asking him to wager his life on moral principle in the middle of a weaponized civic right. Eloan met her fury without flinching. No. The curse is. That shut the chapel still. Seris turned away a pace, one hand braced on the carved reedwork pillar. Outside, the river moved against its posts with a soft, constant hush. She had spent years trusting things that could be measured: foot placement, guard angle, contracts, coin. Now every path before them led through witness, choice, sacrifice, and love named so quietly it felt almost unbearable. Love. The word had sat between them unspoken, growing clearer with every dawn and every danger. Perhaps it had already passed the point where silence made it safer. Behind her, Ivan said with terrible composure, then on solstice I enter the final match knowing I may not walk out of it. Seris turned back at once. No. He looked at her, and the sorrow in his face nearly undid her. Seris. No. Eloan withdrew a few paces, leaving them the center of the chapel and the truth neither could survive much longer without saying. Ivan rose from the stone platform slowly, steadier now beneath the sanctuary's old law but still pale, still too near the edge of something breaking. If I refuse the curse at the wrong moment, he said, and nothing answers but loss, then Arden still has the city, and you have thrown yourself into ruin for you. The words came sharper than intended and much more naked. Say it. He did not move. For what, Ivan? His restraint failed first in the eyes, then the mouth, then all at once in the voice. For me, he said. For me. There. No taking it back. No safer language left. Seris crossed the space between them. I am already in ruin, she said, low and fierce and shaking with the force of finally telling the truth. I have been in it for days. Since the exhibition, perhaps before, since the corridor or the terrace or the first moment you looked at me like defeat was something to grieve. I do not care what the city thinks I lose if it means you live. His breath hitched. She had thought saying it would be like stepping off a cliff. It was more like stepping into deep water and discovering she had been drowning on land. I love you, she said. The chapel held still around the words. Ivan looked as if the world had tilted under him in some kinder way than disaster. For one heartbeat he simply stood there, all his careful restraint stripped down to wonder and pain and love so plain it made her own pulse ache. Then he crossed the last small distance, not as a duelist, not as a cursed man forced toward conquest, but simply as himself. His hands came up slowly, as if asking a question even then, and when she did not pull away he touched her face with a tenderness so reverent it nearly broke her. He bent his forehead to hers. No performance. No witnesses that mattered except the old basin, the moonlight, the shrine, and the truth they had finally chosen. I love you, he said, voice unsteady. I have tried not to. I have failed at it with complete devotion. A laugh escaped her then, wet at the edges and astonished by its own existence. She did not know whether she was laughing or crying until his thumb brushed the corner of her eye and she realized it was both. He kissed her then. It was not hurried, not desperate, Not the kind of thing the pamphleteers in the market would have invented. It was gentle and wondering and full of all the restraint they had practiced until restraint could no longer hide the feeling beneath it. His mouth trembled once against hers, as if even now he could not quite believe he had been allowed this. She answered with both hands at his shoulders, drawing him nearer, not because she feared he would vanish but because she wanted him to know she chose his nearness freely. When they parted, the chapel still breathed around them. The basin water had gone calm. Mother Eloan, who had tact enough to look at the window until speech became possible again, said quietly, "Good. Let the true law be witnessed somewhere before the false one is challenged." Neither Seris nor Ivan managed a reply to that. Outside the chapel, Lynette was pretending not to pace and Oren was failing to pretend not to worry. The moment the door opened, both looked up sharply. Lynette's gaze moved between Seris and Ivan and narrowed with infuriating intelligence. "Oh," she said. Seris, who would have preferred to duel 3 magistrates at once rather than explain her face, said, "Do not begin." "I have not begun anything," Lynette said, which was obviously false. "I am merely perceiving with excellence." Oren, to his credit, focused first on the practical. "Can he stand?" "Yes," Ivan said. "And the solstice?" Oren asked. That brought them all back to the precipice before them. Seris answered. "Arden means to bind the city through the final match in the vault sequence." Oren's face drained. "Then we have almost no time." "We have enough," Seris said, though whether she believed it fully was another question. "We know his aim now. We know the curse's logic. We know the final match is the hinge." Lynette folded her arms. "Then the hinge has to break." "Yes." "How?" Seris looked toward the river, black and silver beyond the reeds. She thought of Mela's question. "Decide before the floor asks." By the time they left the chapel, she had. The solstice championship was posted at dawn, a single final ceremonial bout at the Hall of Measures, citywide witness, closing rite of the white reed season. The contenders named before all Lythre were exactly as Arden had intended. Seris Vale. The Swan Knight. At sight of the board, the square erupted into delighted uproar. Every rumor, every exhibition, every public clash had prepared the city to hunger for this ending. Rivalry resolved in the grandest possible frame. The final match of the season. The supposed inevitable reckoning. Seris looked at the names and felt none of the crowd's anticipation. Only clarity. She knew now why Arden had arranged everything so carefully. Their exhibition had tested the draw. The paired right had measured the braid. The solstice final would harvest the perfected pattern, her formal mastery, his curse-fed witness, the whole city's attention, and the vault of accord ready beneath the floor to seize it all. He expected them to enter as combatants and complete his geometry through struggle. He expected her to fight to win because winning had always been the cleanest language she knew. He expected Ivan to fight to survive because the curse had taught him that survival required conquest. He expected, in short, exactly the 2 people they had once been. He no longer understood the ones they had become. That evening, Seris went to Mela. He was alone in the south yard, oiling an old practice blade while the light faded blue over the terrace walls. At her approach he looked up once and, whatever he saw in her face, set the blade down without comment. "I've decided," she said. "Yes. In the final match, if the floor locks into Arden's intended pattern, I will throw the victory." Even Mela took a breath at that. "You are certain?" "Yes." He studied her for a long moment. "You know what that costs?" "My standing. Your name, if the city chooses malice. Your income. Your place in the circuit. Everything you have built by being reliable in the one language Lythre respects." "Yes. And yet. Something like old grief moved across his face, though he hid it quickly. "Then I taught you almost correctly." She blinked. He stood and came nearer, hands clasped behind him as always when feeling became dangerous territory. "I taught you to prize control, precision, victory earned without cruelty. Necessary lessons. Good ones. But incomplete." His gaze sharpened. "If you can choose to lose for the sake of what is right, and do so with full knowledge, then you are more than the duelist I made. Which is the whole point of teaching anyone anything. It was, from Mela, nearly a benediction. The solstice bells began at sunset and did not stop. Lythre dressed itself in white and silver, in reed lanterns and floating fire and festival silk. Every bridge filled. Every square poured people toward the Hall of Measures. From the terraces above the river, the city looked less like stone than like a constellation laid upon water. Inside the hall, the final match floor had been transformed beyond anything seen during the season. The silver inlay had been extended into a full civic lattice. Witness braziers burned at every point. Above, the banners of every ward hung together for the first time in years. The musicians' gallery was full, not merely with a festival ensemble but with the finest licensed players in Lythre, each one an unwilling thread in Arden's design. The reservoir below the floor was no longer a hidden presence. Seris felt it the instant she entered the western passage. Full. Waiting. Hungry. Ivan stood in the preparation chamber, dressed in formal championship white without mask or concealment. He looked less pale than he had at the rite. The chapel's old law had steadied him. Yet beneath that steadiness, Seris could feel the tension humming in him like a drawn string. She crossed to him at once. "No speeches," she said. That surprised a small smile from him. "I had one prepared." "I know. No speeches." "All right." She took both his hands in hers. She had never done so in full preparation attire, under the shadow of a public match, and the strangeness of it made the moment feel even more sacred. "When the pattern locks," she said quietly, "I will break it." His gaze searched hers. "By throwing the victory." "Yes." Pain flickered across his face. "Seris, your whole life." "My whole life is not worth more than yours." Her grip tightened. "Do not argue. There is only one thing I need from you." He knew before she said it. She saw the knowledge and the fear of it both. "When the curse demands that you claim me," she said, "you refuse." His breath caught. "If I refuse and the binding answers with death, you refuse." He closed his eyes once, hard. When he opened them again, love and terror stood plainly together in them. "You ask much. I know. And if I fail?" She stepped closer, until their foreheads almost touched. "Then fail reaching toward truth, not survival." For a moment he could not speak. "Then, I will try." "No," she whispered, thinking of Eloan's words. "Choose." The herald's first bell rang. He drew a breath that seemed to steady something all the way through him. "I choose." She kissed him once, brief and fierce and without hiding from the meaning of it. Then they went to meet the city. The final match began under thunder. Not literal thunder, though the pamphleteers would no doubt improve the account by morning, but the thunder of thousands of witnesses rising to their feet as Seris Vale and the Swan Knight entered from opposite arches and took the floor beneath the full blaze of the Solstice Hall. Oren spoke the opening in a voice like polished steel. The musicians began. The silver inlay awakened underfoot. The very air of the arena seemed to ring. From the high gallery, Arden watched with satisfaction he did not bother to hide. Seris and Ivan saluted. Then the match began. It was, to the crowd, magnificent. Of course it was. Even corrupted, the structure remained a ceremonial masterpiece, and the two people inside it knew one another's movement too deeply now to make ugliness. Seris fought with all the precision the city expected of her. Ivan answered with music-shaped grace. They circled, crossed, recovered, tested, yielded, pressed. Gasps rose from the galleries. White reed petals drifted from the upper tiers before anyone had given the cue, as if the audience itself could no longer restrain its wonder. Below the wonder, the real contest unfolded. The floor drank every exchange. The reservoir surged. The vault sequence below them woke in widening rings Seris could feel through her bones. The hall's old civic wards began to answer, not in harmony, but under command. Arden sat forward in the gallery, one hand resting lightly on the rail as though already feeling the city gather into his grasp. The match tightened. Seris saw the pattern forming because she understood formal geometry better than Arden ever would. He had designed for her victory. Of course he had. Publicly, it was the cleanest ending, Lythre's disciplined champion triumphing over the mysterious outsider in a final act of civic mastery. Privately, that victorious line would lock the vault sequence through her judicial harmonic anchor, while Ivan's curse, defeated but fully engaged, served as the final transformational key. If she won properly, the city was lost. She changed nothing yet. Too early, and he would adjust. Too early, and the pattern might simply reroute through a different chord. She had to let the geometry believe in itself long enough to expose its spine. Ivan felt it too. She saw the curse beginning to answer in him, the quickening force, the sharpened edge, the dangerous perfection of movement that made the crowd fall half in love with every pass. Twice she saw his jaw tighten against compulsion. Once his blade came in hotter than he intended and struck sparks from hers. Now, he breathed in a close bind. Not yet, she answered. They broke apart. The hall roared. Arden smiled. The music climbed into its penultimate measure. Witness phrases layered. The vault below them surged upward so hard the lower braziers bent white. Seris saw the final geometry arriving, 2 more exchanges, then the decisive line. In Arden's pattern, she would disarm him on the descending turn and lay blade to throat in full public witness. Continuance through lawful victory. City bound. Curse anchored. Theft made permanent. Now. On the next pass, she gave him the opening. Not clumsily. Not with melodrama. With the exquisite deliberateness of a master undoing a machine from inside its own assumptions. Her blade turned a fraction wider than required. Her left foot accepted weight a hair too slowly. To every judge trained in the art, it would still look plausible. To Arden's geometry, it looked like destiny completing itself. Ivan saw it at once. His eyes widened, fear, love, understanding, protest all in one impossible flash. Take it, she told him with her gaze. Break it later. He came through the opening because not doing so would expose them both too soon. Their blades crossed once, twice. Seris let the line go. His weapon swept her guard and touched her in the winning arc. The hall exploded. But the geometry did not. Because the expected victory had not been hers. Because the judicial anchor failed to land where Arden designed it. Because the public line of lawful triumph had been willingly abandoned by the one meant to claim it. The floor lurched. Not metaphor. The inlay under them flashed with such force that several spectators cried out and the musician's tempo broke apart in panic. Below, the vault sequence snarled against its own misfired lock and began to surge sideways through the hall lattice. Arden shot to his feet in the high gallery. This should have been enough. It was not. The curse answered victory. Ivan staggered as the false law tried to claim its payment. He had won before full witness. He had survived. Now the binding demanded completion. Claim the defeated, accept dominion, seal the bargain. Seris saw it hit him like a visible blow. His posture went rigid. White feathering burst at his cuffs and collar. The audience, already half risen in astonishment at the flare, gasped again in confusion. He could save himself now. All he had to do was finish the line the curse demanded, stand over her as conquered rival, accept the hall's witness, and let survival harden into domination one last time. His sword trembled. Seris did not move. She stayed where she had fallen to one knee in the broken geometry, looking up at him through all the noise and light and fracture. Choose, she thought, not daring to speak. Arden shouted something from the gallery, perhaps an order, perhaps only disbelief. The floor howled with light. Ivan's face contorted under the force of the curse. For one terrible heartbeat, Seris thought the compulsion might simply take him, override every gentler law, and use his body as the final key. His blade lifted. Then he looked at her. Not at the city. Not at survival. Not at the cheering and panicking witnesses, or the braziers, or Arden's rage, or the years of fear behind him. At her. And something in him went still in the deepest possible way. He lowered the sword. A single, impossible act. Small as surrender. Vast as revolution. No, he said. The word rang through the hall more sharply than any struck bell. He dropped the blade entirely. It hit the silver-lit floor with a crack that echoed to the rafters. I will not keep myself by claiming her. The curse broke like ice under spring flood. Seris felt it before she understood it. The whole hall did. The false law, fed for years on coerced victory, had met the one thing it could not contain, freely chosen love above survival. The reservoir below them convulsed. The vault sequence reversed. Stolen resonance tore backward through every falsified channel, ripping Arden's hidden lattice open as it went. Light burst up through the floor in white and river blue columns. Witness braziers shattered. The musicians cried out. Above, the ward banners snapped as if caught in storm wind, though the hall held no weather at all. Arden screamed, not loudly, but with genuine loss, because his control of the sequence had turned inside out. Every theft exposed itself at once. Every altered score, every siphoned right, every falsified channel answered its true civic line instead of his. Ivan collapsed. Seris was moving before thought arrived. She caught him at the shoulders as the last of the broken geometry tore past them. Feathers flared once across his throat and arms, white and luminous, then recoiled. His body shook with the violence of being neither one thing nor another for a breath that felt like forever. "Look at me," she said, heedless now of every witness in the city. "Ivan. Look at me." His eyes found hers, wild and fading. The old swanblood vow, Eloan had said, bound form to chosen witness. To be seen truly and still remain. So Seris gave the whole city truth. "This is Ivan Marceau," she said, voice carrying harder than she had known it could without a herald's mantle. "He is no beast of your stories and no weapon of your chancellor's making. He is mine in love and his own in soul, and I witness him." The hall held. The broken light changed. What had been violent became clear. The white flare around him steadied, drew inward, and settled into human shape, not as performance, not as curse compromise, but as truth received. His breathing returned in a ragged rush. The feathering vanished. His hand, when it gripped hers, was wholly a man's. Around them, the city stared. Then the shouting began. Not panic now. Revelation. Guards surging toward the high gallery. Judges demanding explanation. Oren's voice rising with the force of law at last unshackled from ceremony. Lynette, somewhere to the right, yelling something triumphant and probably profane about the lower channels. Mela already on the floor, blade bare not for the duel but for the aftermath. Arden tried to flee. He got as far as the upper stair before the hall guards, now with every civic ward in the building answering their rightful lines instead of his, cut him off. For one dazzling instant his polished composure remained. Then the first judge publicly named the broken vault and the second ordered the underfloor seals opened, and the chancellor's smile failed him forever. The rest blurred for a while. There were officials. Testimony. Opened lower chambers blazing with exposed stolen resonance. Musicians confirming score tampering. Oren producing requisitions from somewhere inside his robes like a conjurer of bureaucracy. Lynette nearly vibrating with vindicated fury. Mela standing near enough that no one foolish approached Seris and Ivan too abruptly. Mother Eloan arriving without hurry, as though she had known precisely when truth would finish its work. Through all of it, Seris remained kneeling on the floor beside Ivan until he could stand. When at last he did, unsteady but human and free, the hall fell quiet again. Not because anyone ordered it. Because everyone present understood that the ending they had expected was gone, and something truer had happened in its place. Weeks later, when the river ran softer and the last white reed banners had come down, Lythre was still speaking of the solstice match. But it spoke differently now. The Hall of Measures was closed for 12 days while the undervaults were cleansed, the siphon channels dismantled, and the old civic lines restored under public oversight. Arden awaited formal judgment under triple witness and no small amount of collective disgust. The Music Guild reclaimed authority over ceremonial scores. The judges stripped several festival offices of power. Oren, to his lasting horror, was praised in council minutes for indispensable moral steadiness. Lynette demanded this be carved somewhere permanent. Seris lost what she had expected to lose, and almost none of what she feared. Some patrons withdrew, offended that she had compromised the integrity of a final match. Others came forward in doubled support, declaring that integrity had been precisely what she preserved. The city argued, naturally. It would always argue. But even those who disliked her choice could not deny the visible truth of the broken vault beneath the hall, the exposed theft, or the fact that Arden's design had collapsed the instant she relinquished victory and Ivan refused to claim it. Tavin Sorrel, with the embarrassing earnestness of youth, informed Mela that Lady Vale had permanently improved his understanding of honor. Mela told him to stop speaking like a commemorative plaque. As for Ivan, freedom did not arrive gently. The first mornings after the curse broke, he woke startled by the absence of its tug. He no longer needed sanctioned bouts to remain human. He no longer felt the compulsion rise when bells rang for civic rights. Sometimes he stood at the North Bend with the river wind in his hair and simply breathed as if relearning what an unbargained day felt like. Seris went with him when she could. They did not hurry the shape of what came after. They had already crossed the hardest threshold. What followed was not spectacle but tenderness, and tenderness, Seris found, required a different kind of courage than combat. They walked the quieter bridges at dawn. They trained without pretense in the South Court, now no longer rivals but something far better. He laughed more. She did too, though still rarely enough that each time felt like a secret reward. When he kissed her now, it was with the same wonder as in the chapel, but less disbelief each time that such happiness had truly been allowed. 1 month after the solstice, beneath a sky clear as polished glass and with the river carrying summer light like poured silver, they were married. Not in the Hall of Measures. At the North Lake Chapel. Mother Eloan presided. Mela stood near the rear with a posture suggesting he had no opinions about romance whatsoever, while visibly arriving earlier than everyone else. Lynette cried openly and denied it. Oren handled the witness role with flawless ceremony and a private expression of profound relief that, for once, the proceedings were not attached to scandal or attempted civic theft. Tavin nearly forgot the order of attendance because he was staring at everything with painful sincerity. Dame Iselle sent white flowers and a note stating that if either bridegroom or bride made the vows sound dull, she would never forgive them. Seris wore no championship silver, only river blue with a narrow white sash. Ivan wore ash grey and white, simple and elegant. No masks. No false names. No borrowed survival. The vows were older than the duels. Older, perhaps, than the city. To be witnessed truly and still remain. To choose and be chosen without coercion. To bear one another's burdens freely. To keep faith not through conquest, but through devotion. When it came time for Seris to speak, she looked at him and felt none of the old fear that tenderness would unmake her. It had remade her, yes. Into someone braver than victory alone could ever require. I once believed, she said, her voice carrying softly through the chapel and out toward the reeds, that the only safe way to live was to become excellent enough that no one could move me from my place. Then you came into my life like music into a measured hall, and I learned that love is not the loss of discipline. It is the truest reason to use it well. I choose you in witness, in peace, in every ordinary morning that follows this one. Ivan's eyes had already gone bright before she finished. When his turn came, he did not try for elegance beyond honesty. I lived too long believing survival was the highest law, he said. You taught me that love can be higher without being fragile. You saw me where the curse tried to make me a performance, and you called me by my own name until I could remain in it. I choose you above fear, above flight, above every false victory. I choose you gladly. When they kissed, the reeds outside stirred in the wind as though applauding more gently than a city ever could. Afterward there was music, and bread, and river wine, and laughter under the summer sky. No one duelled. No one siphoned. No one mistook spectacle for truth. Near sunset, when the guests had drifted toward the chapel garden and the river had gone gold at its edges, Seris and Ivan stood together on the small wooden landing beneath the reeds. The water moved quietly against the posts. White birds wheeled far off over the marsh, bright in the falling light. He took her hand. Not from need now. From joy. The city still tells stories about us, he said. It always will. Some of them include lightning. She looked up at him. There was never lightning. I know. His smile deepened. But perhaps we should allow them one inaccuracy. They have so few. She leaned into him, head against his shoulder, and listened to the river. Above them, The last light of day laid a path of gold across the water, and for once nothing in the world was demanding victory. Only presence. Witness. Love freely chosen and returned. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was home. Morning came softly to Lythre after the wedding, as if even the city had decided not to rush them. Mist lay low over the river, turning the bridges into pale arches suspended in light. The chapel garden had gone quiet at last. Lanterns from the previous night still hung among the reeds, their candles long burned out, their paper shades moving faintly whenever the wind passed through. Somewhere below, water touched the posts of the landing with a slow, regular sound that reminded Seris of measured breathing. She woke before the bells, as she always had. For one suspended moment she did not understand why the room felt different. The small guest chamber in the chapel house was plain whitewashed walls, a narrow window, a carved cedar chest, the folded remains of yesterday's ceremony clothes laid carefully over a chair. Familiar enough things. Yet the quiet was warmer than any room she had ever woken in before. Less like solitude. More like being held. Then she felt the weight beside her shift. Ivan was still asleep, one hand loose against the coverlet between them, his face turned slightly toward the morning light. Without the strain of the curse shadowing him, sleep had changed him. Not entirely, sorrow had shaped him too long to vanish in a month, but peace sat more naturally on him now. The tension once wound into the corners of his mouth had softened. The line between his brows was gentler. He looked younger like this, and stronger too, in the way people sometimes do when they no longer have to spend so much of themselves enduring. Seris lay still and watched him. There was a kind of astonishment in it that had not yet worn away. She had expected love to be sharp, perhaps, or consuming, or dangerous in the sweeping way songs preferred. She had not expected this. The quiet wonder of being allowed to remain and to witness someone remaining beside her. His lashes stirred. A moment later his eyes opened, grey in the dim light, still half blurred by sleep until they found her face. For one heartbeat he only looked at her. Then the smallest smile, still somehow precious enough to unsettle her, touched his mouth. "You're staring," he murmured. "You were asleep. It seemed safe." He made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh and turned onto one elbow. "Have I married a woman who watches people as though they are dueling forms to be memorized?" "Yes. I was afraid of that." She let her gaze move over him in deliberate assessment. "Your form improves in repose. Less apologizing in the shoulders." His smile deepened. "You are impossible." "No. Merely observant." He reached out then and touched one finger lightly to the inside of her wrist, where no cuff wrap marked the skin this morning. Such a little gesture, and yet something in her stillness yielded to it as naturally as breath. "Good morning, my wife," he said. The words should not have struck so hard. They did anyway. Seris had spent years mastering herself against surprise, but there was no defense against the simple tenderness of that title in his voice. Wife. Not champion. Not duelist. Not rival. Not useful weapon hired for someone else's cause. Wife. She covered his hand with hers and held it there. "Good morning, my husband," she answered, and discovered that saying it felt less like claiming something new than like naming a truth that had been waiting all along. He kissed her then, unhurried and soft, with morning quiet still around them and no witness required beyond light, breath, and the certainty of each other. She had feared once that love might loosen her edges until she no longer knew herself. Instead, it had done something stranger and better. It had left her fully herself and made that self less lonely. Later, after bread and honey and tea brought by a low and smiling niece, after Lynette had hammered on the door only long enough to announce that married people were insufferable and that breakfast in the garden would not wait indefinitely, after Oren had arrived carrying an armful of flowers he claimed not to have chosen personally, the day unfolded into the kind of happiness Seris once would have distrusted simply because it was so unguarded. People lingered. That, too, surprised her. She had assumed the witnesses would depart after the ceremony, that the event would close with proper vows and gentle dispersal. Instead, the chapel grounds filled slowly again with a second, easier gathering. Mela came back under the pretense of returning a ceremonial cloth he could easily have handed to anyone. Dame Iselle's messenger arrived with a lacquered box of sugared fruit and a note declaring that marriages deserved better sweets than festivals ever provided. Tavin appeared carrying far too many flowers because he had misunderstood an instruction and bought every stem from the market stall rather than a reasonable number. Lythre took one look at him and said, "You are either the future of civic honor or its most decorative casualty." Tavin, who had not yet developed resistance to her, turned red enough to match the roses. The North Chapel garden, with its white stones and reed beds and strips of river light between the posts, became by degrees a place of music and laughter and conversation loose enough to make Seris slightly suspicious of reality. At one point, she found herself seated beside Mela at the long outdoor table while Auron argued with Lythre over whether his ceremonial voice had improved public morale during the hall crisis or merely prevented a stampede. "Both," Lythre said. "You have a useful tone for orderly alarm. I am not taking that as praise. You should. I despise most people's tones." Mela, to Seris's astonishment, hid a smile in his cup. She turned to him. "You are in unusually generous spirits. I attended a wedding instead of a conspiracy." He sliced bread with unnecessary precision. "Novelty has its pleasures." After a moment, he added more quietly, "You look well." From anyone else, the words might have passed easily. From Mela, they landed with the weight of old care. Seris set down her cup. "Thank you." His gaze shifted toward the river, where Ivan stood at the edge of the landing with Tavin, apparently explaining something about foot placement while both of them held their hands out in the air as though invisible blades were involved. "You were right to do what you did," Mela said. She looked at him sharply. He did not glance back. At the match. There were still hours, in the days since solstice, when doubt came to sit with her. Not because she regretted the choice, but because she knew exactly how much had turned on it. One failed calculation. One broken nerve. One wrong angle, and she might have handed Arden the city instead of saving it. It was difficult not to look back at that flaw and imagine all the ways the gamble might have failed. Perhaps Mela knew that. Perhaps he merely knew her. "I know," she said, though more softly than certainty would have made it. "No," he replied. "You know that you would choose it again. That is not the same thing." She let the distinction settle. Across the garden, Ivan looked up from whatever he was showing Tavin and found her gaze at once. The habit of it still startled her a little, how quickly he found her in any room, any crowd, any space with light enough to see. When he smiled this time, not one of his restrained almost smiles but the fuller version that had become more common these last weeks, she felt something inside her answer with such immediate warmth that she stopped trying to pretend it did not undo her. Mela followed her line of sight and cleared his throat. "I'll say one sentimental thing," he said, with the severe resignation of a man negotiating with his own dignity. "Only one. Then I expect it never to be mentioned again." Seris nearly laughed. "Very well. You fight better now." She blinked. "Now?" "Yes. Since him." It was not what she expected. Mela set the bread knife down. "Not because you have gone soft," he added, clearly offended by the possibility. "Because you have gone exact in a new way. Less guarded. More truthful. You no longer waste effort pretending not to care what you care about. Most people cannot manage that. It makes them stronger when they can." For once, Seris had no clever answer ready. Mela rose before she could find one. "There," he said, as if irritated by his own honesty. "My one sentimental thing is complete. If anyone asks, I insulted the flowers." He left her with the odd ache that real kindness sometimes caused when it arrived wearing an unexpected face. By midday, the garden meal had dissolved into smaller conversations and wandering paths through the reeds. Auron was commandeered by Aloan's niece to help hang fresh ribbons along the outer posts because, as Lythre observed, he had the posture of a man born to be useful at ceremonies whether he liked it or not. Lythre herself sat cross-legged on the landing rail with a slate in her lap, already drafting a furious proposal for oversight reforms to the city's ritual offices. Tavin, having been gently prevented from buying an entire market a second time, took up the task of carrying empty cups and looked honored to do it. Seris slipped away for a little while and found the path that curved behind the chapel toward the narrower bank where reeds grew thickest and the river bent out toward the marsh. She had always liked thresholds more than centers. Terraces, bridges, court edges, corridor turns, the place just before a bell sounded or just after a room emptied. Perhaps because thresholds asked for attention. Perhaps because they offered choices without demanding spectacle. The path behind the chapel was all thresholds, water and land, silence and birdsong, old vows and new days. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps exactly. The subtle change in quiet that came when Ivan entered it. "You vanish elegantly," he said as he came up beside her. "I learned from a man who wore a mask and let the city invent him." He made that soft huff of amusement she had come to love almost as much as his laugh. "I behaved very badly, in retrospect. You behaved mysteriously." Lythre made the rest up. They walked on together until the path opened to a narrow shelf of riverbank where white flowers grew in the grass. The water here moved slower, broad and reflective, carrying pieces of sky. For a time they said nothing. They had become better at that too, at shared silence without strain. It no longer felt like an absence to fill. It felt like rest. At last Ivan said, "This morning I woke expecting the old pull." She turned toward him. It only lasted a moment, he continued, looking out over the river. "A habit of fear, perhaps. Or of memory. For years I woke measuring myself by what the curse had left me after the night. Voice, shape, thought. How much was still mine to keep?" His hand moved once at his side, then stilled. "Today I reached for that fear first and found nothing there but air." Something in his voice went so quiet at the end that it seemed to widen the whole riverside around them. Seris took his hand. He looked down at their joined fingers as though even now he sometimes needed reminding that such ordinary mercies were real. "Does it frighten you?" she asked. He considered honestly. "A little." "Why?" "Because I do not yet know what to build where survival used to live." The answer was so plain, so entirely him, that she felt tenderness rise in her throat like a held breath. "Then build slowly," she said. "You are not late to your own life." His gaze lifted to hers. That sounds like something Eloan would say if she had trained with Mela. An alarming thought. The city would never recover. He smiled then, but it did not hide the seriousness beneath. "And you?" She knew what he meant. Not the city, not the reforms, not the chapel guests drifting beyond the reeds. "Ha!" She turned back toward the water, giving herself the honest shape of the answer before she spoke it. "I used to believe I was safest when I was useful in the exact way people expected. Reliable. Controlled. Difficult to displace." She watched the sunlight fracture over the surface. "I do not think I understood how tired that made me until I stopped. And now I find I like being a person more than being an instrument." He let out a breath that sounded almost like reverence. "Seris." She glanced at him. "Do not become poetic at me on our first morning. I am unprepared. I am your husband. I am contractual entitled to at least one small poem. Show me the clause. I'll ask Lynette to draft it." That woman would add penalties. She would add footnotes. They were both smiling by then, and because the moment was too good not to answer honestly, Seris stepped closer and rested her forehead lightly against his shoulder. His free hand came up at once to hold her there, not with fear of losing, not with astonishment any longer, but with that growing naturalness she loved most in him, the deepening certainty that love need not always feel miraculous to remain sacred. They stood that way until the chapel bells finally began to ring the noon hour. In the weeks that followed, married life proved less dramatic than the ballads would have preferred and infinitely better for it. They returned to Lythre not as spectacle, though the city tried very hard to make them one, but as part of its living fabric. The Hall of Measures reopened under stricter civic oversight, with Lynette's reforms incorporated so extensively into the new ritual regulations that she complained no one would ever appreciate how beautiful her administrative structure was. Oren was appointed interim coordinator for ceremonial integrity, a title that made him look genuinely ill each time someone said it aloud. Dame Iselle sponsored a public scholarship for young duelists from poor wards, insisting that talent should not have to depend on decorative patrons forever. Tavin enrolled in the scholarship's first cohort and thereafter regarded both Seris and Ivan with the solemn gratitude of a man who had not yet learned how unbearable sincerity could be in large doses. Seris still fought, though not as often and no longer for every contract laid before her. She chose the matches that mattered, those that settled real disputes cleanly, those that preserved the principle of ritual without feeding vanity, those that reminded the city what ceremonial combat was for before Arden had taught it to become hungry. Her reputation altered. Less convenient, perhaps. More formidable. Some patrons no longer hired her because they found her impossible to manipulate. Others hired her precisely for that reason. She discovered, slowly, that freedom could be disciplined too. Ivan taught more than he fought. At first the city attended his practice demonstrations out of fascination, eager to see the freed swan shifter whose name had become inseparable from the solstice match. But curiosity could not sustain reverence forever, and when spectacle faded what remained was the reality of him, a patient, exacting, unexpectedly gentle teacher who understood better than most what force ought never to become. He worked with young duelists who struggled to find balance, with ceremonial musicians relearning trust in the hall's old forms, with ward apprentices trying to understand how witness and intention could coexist without corruption. The first time Seris saw him guiding a nervous 12-year-old through a recovery turn without once letting the boy feel foolish, she had to leave the room for a full minute and stare at a corridor wall until her composure returned. He found her there afterward. "You vanished," he said. "I was thinking." "That sounds ominous." It was not ominous. She folded her arms. "You are annoyingly good with children." His expression changed at once from concern to helpless amusement. "That is your accusation." "For the moment." He came nearer, smiling with too much understanding. "I'll try to improve in more objectionable directions." "That seems unlikely. Your instincts are all morally inconvenient." "Fortunately, I married a woman with better access to mischief." It was intolerable, how often he made laughter arrive before she had time to defend herself. She was still discovering that being known did not always require losing ground. Sometimes it meant being met exactly where one stood. On autumn evenings they often returned to the North Chapel, not because they needed sanctuary in the old desperate way, but because gratitude itself can become a kind of pilgrimage. Eloan would sometimes share tea with them on the outer landing and talk about the river as though it were an old scholar with a bad temper and sound principles. Linnet came once and declared the reeds under-organized. Oren came once and spent 20 minutes admiring the silence before admitting that he found it deeply suspicious. Winter brought quieter things. Shared books in lamplight. Practice blades leaning by the door while snow mist silvered the city roofs. Ordinary meals. Ordinary disagreements. The discovery that Ivan preferred pears to apples, while Seris considered both acceptable only if not overripe. The fact that he hummed absently while oiling blades, always a little under the note, which offended her ear enough that she began humming back in the correct key and thereby found herself, by degrees, participating in something perilously close to domestic happiness. It was ridiculous. It was magnificent. One evening, near the year's turn, they were invited to witness the first major civic rite performed under the reformed ceremonial structure. Not a duel. A bridge renewal at Reedmaker Crossing, modest but symbolically important. The city gathered with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Musicians tuned carefully. Judges stood ready. The new oversight markings were visible to anyone who knew how to look. Seris and Ivan stood in the crowd rather than on the ceremonial platform. When the rite began, the resonance rose through the bridge stones clean and bright. No downward drag. No theft. No hidden hunger in the structure. The magic moved as it was meant to move outward, shared, strengthening the crossing for everyone who would use it. Seris felt Ivan go still beside her, not with pain this time, but with wonder. When the final note resolved and the bridge lamps flared steady gold from end to end, the crowd cheered. Not the ravenous cheer of spectacle. The relieved, communal sound of trust returning where it belonged. Ivan's hand found hers in the dark between cloaks. "Well," he said very quietly, "that is almost enough to make me forgive your city." "Do not become too generous," she murmured. "It will get arrogant." "It already is." "Yes. But now it has reason. He looked down at her then, riverlamp light turning his features warm against the winter dusk, and she was struck all at once by the long shape of everything that had changed. Not only the city, not only the duels, herself, him. The future they now occupied not by accident or bargain, but by choosing and choosing again. There had been a time when she believed the most meaningful moments in life would always arrive with steel and witnesses and bells. Instead, some of the truest had arrived like this, in morning light over a narrow bed, in a riverside joke, in the absence of a curse's pull, in a bridge holding clean magic again, in a hand reached for without fear. Years later, the children of Lythre would still ask for the story of the solstice match. They would ask whether the Swan Knight truly cast down his sword before the whole city. Whether Seris Vale truly threw a winning line on purpose. Whether the floor of the Hall of Measures really burst with river blue light. Whether Chancellor Arden shouted like an outraged gull when the guards took him, a detail Lynette insisted was accurate and Oren insisted was beneath civic record. The answers depended on who was telling the tale. Tavin, grown older and somewhat less decorative, told it to his students as a lesson in honor. Oren told it as a cautionary account of administrative overreach and the necessity of competent ceremonial procedure. Lynette told it as proof that bureaucratic precision was more romantic than ballads had ever understood. Mela rarely told it at all, but once, when pressed by a stubborn apprentice, he merely said, "Choose carefully what victory costs you," and considered the matter closed. As for Seris and Ivan, they told it rarely and never for spectacle. When they spoke of it together, usually on late evenings when the river was dark beyond the windows and the city bells had long since gone quiet, they did not begin with the match. They began with a first exhibition. A wrong note beneath the floor. A masked stranger who moved like music and looked grieved by triumph. A woman too disciplined to trust easily and too honest not to pursue what troubled her. A false rivalry that became trust. A trust that became tenderness. A tenderness that learned, under great pressure, to call itself love. All the rest had followed from that. And because stories deserve endings worthy of the truths they contain, this one kept ending not once but daily in small faithful ways. In the morning, when Seris woke first and watched light move across Ivan's face before he stirred. At noon, when they crossed the market and he reached automatically for the heavier basket because he knew she disliked carrying fruit. In the evening, when practice gave way to supper and supper to quiet conversation and quiet conversation to shared silence that no longer needed defending. In the winter, when snow mist touched the bridges and the city lamps shone gold through it. In the spring, when the reeds by the North Chapel brightened again and white birds returned over the marsh. In every ceremony remade honest. In every ordinary day no longer ruled by survival. In every moment one looked at the other and saw, with no curse left to contradict it, the chosen witness of a life freely shared. That was the true ending. Not the hall exploding in light, nor the villain brought down, nor even the wedding beneath the reeds. The true ending was that they remained. And remained. And remained.